Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been working the midnight shift for Colorado State Patrol for 8 years now. And let me tell you something about the night highways that most people don't understand. Between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m., you're not just dealing with drunk drivers and speeders. You're dealing with people who have secrets. People who are running from something. And sometimes you find yourself chasing those secrets down dark country roads where cell towers are scarce and backup is 20 minutes away on a good night. The thing about working nights is that it changes you. Your sleep schedule gets completely inverted, your social life disappears, and you start seeing the world differently. During the day, highways are filled with commuters and families and business travelers, people living normal lives, going normal places. But at night, especially in the dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m., the only people on the road are the ones who have to be there. And trust me, there's usually a story behind why someone has to be driving through rural Colorado at 3 in the morning. Some of those stories are innocent enough. Nurses heading home from late shifts, truck drivers trying to make delivery schedules, maybe someone rushing to the hospital for a family emergency. But others, well, others involve drugs, violence, desperation, and choices that people make when they think nobody's watching. The night that changed everything for me started like any other Tuesday in October. I was patrolling a 60-mile stretch of Highway 36 between Boulder and Denver, the kind of lonely road that cuts through farmland and small towns where most folks are asleep by 10 p.m. The radio had been quiet for the better part of 3 hours, just the occasional truck stop check-in or a fellow trooper calling in his location. My name is Officer Jake Morrison, badge number 4272, and I'd gotten comfortable with the rhythm of night patrol. Coffee at midnight from the 24-hour gas station near Lyons, gas station sweep at 1:30 to check on the overnight clerk, another coffee at 3 from the vending machine at the rest stop. Simple routine that kept me alert and gave the local business owners some peace of mind. But at 2:47 a.m., everything went sideways. Unit 472, we have a possible stolen vehicle, red 2019 Dodge Challenger, license plate Delta, Mike 7492, last seen heading west on Highway 36 near mile marker 43. Vehicle may be armed and dangerous. Proceed with extreme caution. The voice on the radio was Sarah Chen, one of our best dispatchers. She'd been working nights almost as long as I had, and I could hear something in her tone that immediately put me on alert. Sarah didn't use phrases like armed and dangerous unless she had real reason to believe it was true. I was only about 4 miles from mile marker 43, so I hit the lights and pushed my Crown Vic hard down the empty highway. Armed and dangerous always gets your blood pumping, but what really caught my attention was the timing. It was almost 3 in the morning on a Tuesday night. What kind of car thief picks that time to make their move? Professional thieves work during busy daylight hours when they can blend in. Joyride kids usually steal cars on weekend nights when they're drunk and stupid. This felt different. Calculated. Wrong. The section of Highway 36 I patrol runs through some of the most isolated terrain in Boulder County. During the day, you can see for miles in every direction. Rolling hills, distant mountains, scattered farmhouses connected by gravel roads that seem to lead nowhere. But at night, those same hills and valleys become a maze of shadows where someone could disappear completely if they knew the area well enough. As I approached mile marker 43, I saw taillights disappearing over a hill about half a mile ahead. Could be anything. A late shift worker heading home, maybe someone driving to the airport for an early flight. But my gut told me to check it out. 8 years of night patrol teaches you to trust that gut feeling, especially when something doesn't fit the usual pattern. I closed the distance carefully, keeping my headlights off and running silent. The Crown Vic's engine is loud, but at highway speeds with windows up, most drivers don't notice a patrol car following them unless they're specifically looking for one. As I crested the hill, I got my first clear look at the vehicle. Red Dodge Challenger. Exactly what dispatch had described. But here's what made my skin crawl. The driver was maintaining exactly the speed limit. Not speeding, not driving erratically, just cruising at 55 miles per hour like they had all the time in the world. Car thieves don't drive stolen vehicles like they're taking their grandmother to church. They either floor it because they're panicking, or they drive super paranoid, constantly checking mirrors and taking weird routes to avoid main roads. This driver was acting like they owned the car, which meant one of two things. Either dispatch had the wrong information, or I was dealing with someone a lot more dangerous than your average car thief. I called it in, keeping my voice low and professional. Dispatch, Unit 472. I have visual contact with the Red Challenger. License confirmed Delta Mike 7492. Vehicle is traveling westbound at normal speed. No signs of erratic driving. Request additional information on the theft report. Unit 472. Stand by for additional information. While I waited for dispatch, I maintained my distance and tried to get a better look at the driver. The Challenger's windows were tinted, but not illegally dark. I could make out a single occupant, male from what I could tell by the silhouette. He seemed calm, maybe even too calm for someone driving a stolen car with a state trooper less than a quarter mile behind him. The highway stretched ahead of us, empty and dark except for our 2 sets of headlights. To our left and right, farmland extended into the darkness, broken occasionally by the distant glow of a house or barn. It was the kind of terrain where you could dump a body and it might not be found for months, or where someone could have a drug operation running in an old grain silo without any neighbors close enough to notice the traffic. Unit 472, this is dispatch. The vehicle was reported stolen approximately 45 minutes ago from a residence in Westminster. Complainant states the vehicle was taken from their driveway while they were inside their home. Complainant also reports that their teenage daughter is missing and may be in the vehicle. Vehicle should be considered extremely dangerous. Missing teenager. Those 2 words changed everything. This wasn't about a stolen car anymore. This was potentially an abduction, and the calm, controlled driving suddenly made a lot more sense. Whoever was behind the wheel knew exactly what they were doing, and they had a 17-year-old girl's life in their hands. My training kicked in immediately. High-risk vehicle stop procedures for potential kidnapping cases are specific and non-negotiable. You don't take chances with a victim's life, which means you don't do anything that might cause the suspect to panic and hurt their captive. But you also don't let them get away, because every mile they travel could be taking them closer to a location where they plan to dispose of evidence, including human evidence. But here's where things started going wrong. The Challenger suddenly accelerated, not dramatically, but enough to pull away from me. The driver had finally noticed me in their mirrors, and they were making their first move. Dispatch, Unit 472, suspect vehicle is accelerating, now traveling approximately 70 miles per hour. I'm going to attempt a traffic stop, still requesting backup and requesting information on the missing juvenile. Unit 472. Backup is en route. ETA approximately 15 minutes. Missing juvenile is Madison Elizabeth Cooper, age 17, blonde hair, green eyes, approximately 5'6", Last seen wearing blue jeans and a white hoodie. 15 minutes. In a high-speed chase with a potential kidnapping victim, 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. Highway 36 has dozens of side roads and county routes that branch off into some of the most remote territory in Colorado. If the driver knew the area, they could disappear into a network of ranch roads and forest service trails where even helicopters would have trouble tracking them. But I had no choice. I hit my emergency lights and siren and moved in for the stop. The Challenger's response was immediate and terrifying. Instead of pulling over or even trying to outrun me, the driver maintained their speed and turned on their hazard lights. Not their brake lights, not their turn signal, their hazard lights. Like they were signaling some kind of distress. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Car thieves don't turn on hazard lights when police try to stop them. Kidnappers don't signal distress to the cops chasing them. But someone in genuine trouble might do exactly that. I'd been a state trooper long enough to know that situations like this rarely follow the textbook. Real life is messy and complicated, and sometimes the person you think is the criminal turns out to be another victim. But I'd also seen enough domestic violence cases to know that abusers are masters of manipulation, and some of them are smart enough to create situations where they look like the victim, even when they're the perpetrator. I got on the radio again, trying to keep the confusion out of my voice. Dispatch, Unit 472. Suspect vehicle has activated hazard lights but is not stopping. Request immediate information on vehicle owner and circumstances of the theft report. Unit 472. Vehicle is registered to Robert James Cooper, same address as complainant. Running additional information now. Cooper. Same last name as the missing girl. This was getting more complicated by the second. If Robert Cooper owned the car and Madison Cooper was his daughter, then who called in the theft report? And who was driving the car? The most obvious answer was that Madison had taken her father's car without permission, and he'd reported it stolen. But that didn't explain why she was considered missing, or why the vehicle was supposed to be considered extremely dangerous. Teenage runaways don't usually pose a threat to anyone except themselves, unless there was more to the story. There's always more to the story. The Challenger suddenly took a hard right onto County Road 27, a narrow two-lane road that headed north into some of the most remote farmland in the county. I followed, but something was nagging at me. County Road 27 led to exactly nowhere important. Just scattered farmhouses, a couple of old barns, and eventually dead-ended at the South Platte River. If you're kidnapping someone, you don't drive them to a dead end unless you're planning something final. But if you're running from something, you might take any escape route you could find, even one that led nowhere. The road surface changed from smooth asphalt to rough pavement, patched with gravel. My Crown Vic bounced and rattled as I tried to keep up with the Challenger, which seemed to be handling the poor road conditions much better than my patrol car. The driver was clearly familiar with County Road 27, because they were taking curves at speeds that should have put them in a ditch, but they maintained perfect control. Dispatch, Unit 472, pursuit continuing north on County Road 27. Request immediate backup and request you contact the reporting party to confirm details of the theft report. Something isn't adding up here. Unit 472, understood. Be advised, backup is still 8 to 10 minutes out due to your current location. Also be advised, we're having difficulty reaching the reporting party at the provided phone number. That last part hit me like a punch to the gut. If dispatch couldn't reach the person who reported the car stolen, it meant one of two things. Either they were asleep and not answering their phone, or they weren't available to answer their phone for other reasons. Like they were dead. The Challenger was starting to pull away from me now. Crown Vics are reliable, but they're not built for high-speed chases against modern muscle cars on rough country roads. The driver was clearly experienced behind the wheel, taking each curve at exactly the right speed to maintain control while maximizing distance. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the brief moments when the Challenger's brake lights illuminated the interior of the car, I could see two distinct silhouettes: the driver and someone in the passenger seat who appeared to be slumped over. Either Madison Cooper was unconscious in that car, or she was already dead. I pushed the Crown Vic harder than I'd ever pushed a patrol car before, but physics is physics. The Challenger continued to pull away, and County Road 27 was getting more remote with every mile. Cell phone coverage was spotty out here, and if I lost radio contact with dispatch, I'd be completely on my own with a potential killer. Dispatch, Unit 472. I can confirm there are 2 occupants in the suspect vehicle. Passenger appears to be unconscious or worse. This is now a Code 3 emergency. Need all available units and request medical standby. Unit 472. All available units are en route, but your location is extremely remote. Be advised, we're having difficulty contacting the reporting party to confirm theft details. The road ahead curved sharply to the left around a stand of cottonwood trees, and for a moment I lost sight of the Challenger's taillights. When I came around the curve, I expected to see them pulling further away down the straight stretch that followed. Instead, I saw something that made me slam on my brakes so hard that the Crown Vic went into a skid. The Challenger was stopped in the middle of the road, driver's door open, hazard lights still flashing. But there was no sign of the driver or the passenger. I called it in immediately while trying to control my skidding patrol car and scanning the surrounding area for any sign of movement. Dispatch, Unit 472. Suspect vehicle is abandoned on County Road 27, approximately 6 miles north of Highway 36. Driver and passenger are not visible. May have fled on foot into the surrounding terrain. Request K9 units and spotlight-equipped vehicles. Unit 472. Backup ETA now 4 minutes. Do not approach the vehicle alone. Maintain your position and wait for backup. The abandoned Challenger sat in my headlights like some kind of ominous monument. The driver's door hung open at an odd angle, and I could see that the interior dome light was on. The hazard lights continued their rhythmic flashing, casting alternating red shadows across the road and the surrounding grass. But as I sat there watching the abandoned car, I heard something that changed everything. A voice, weak but definitely human, calling for help from somewhere near the vehicle. Help. Please, somebody help me. Every piece of training I'd ever received told me to wait for backup. Never approach a potentially dangerous situation alone, especially with a possible kidnapping victim involved. The Colorado State Patrol Manual is very specific about officer safety protocols, and what I was considering violated several of them. But that voice was getting weaker, and if Madison Cooper was injured and bleeding out in a ditch somewhere, 4 minutes might be too long. I made the hardest decision of my career. I got out of my patrol car, drew my service weapon, and approached the Challenger. Madison. Madison Cooper? This is Colorado State Patrol. If you can hear me, keep talking so I can find you. The voice responded, definitely female, definitely young, but so weak I could barely make out the words. Here, I'm here. Please help me. The voice was coming from the passenger side of the Challenger, but as I got closer, I realized the passenger wasn't in the car anymore. The passenger door was also open, though I hadn't been able to see it from my patrol car's position. Whatever had happened here, both occupants had left the vehicle in a hurry. I followed the sound of the voice into the tall grass that lined the road. The ground was uneven and full of hidden holes and rocks, the kind of terrain where someone running in the dark could easily trip and fall. My flashlight beam swept back and forth across the grass, looking for any sign of movement or color that didn't belong. Keep talking, Madison. I'm a police officer and I'm here to help you. Where are you hurt? My arm. I think it's broken. And my head. I found her about 30 feet from the road, lying in a depression between two small hills. Madison Cooper was exactly what the dispatch description had said. 17 years old, blonde hair, wearing jeans and a white hoodie that was now stained with blood from a head wound. She was conscious but disoriented, with what appeared to be a serious head injury and an arm that was definitely broken. But she was alive, and that's what mattered most. Madison, I'm Officer Morrison with the Colorado State Patrol. You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened? Where's the person who was driving the car? Madison's response came out in broken fragments between tears and obvious shock. He was supposed to help me, but then he got scared and ran. Who got scared? Who was driving the car, Madison? My cousin, Danny. He was trying to get me away from the house. None of this was making sense. If her cousin had been helping her escape from something, why had the car been reported stolen? And why had Danny run away when the police showed up? Madison, I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight. Start from the beginning and take your time. What came out was a story that turned everything I thought I knew about the situation completely upside down. Madison hadn't been kidnapped. She'd been trying to get home. Her father, Robert Cooper, had come home drunk again, but this time was different from his usual drinking binges. This time he'd brought a gun, and he'd been talking about how the family would be better off if they were all dead. Madison's mother had locked herself in the bedroom and called 911, but Robert had started breaking down the door. Madison had called her cousin Danny, who lived about 20 miles away. Danny was 19, had his own car, but it was in the shop for repairs. When Madison called him in a panic, begging him to come get her before her father killed everyone in the house, Danny had made a split-second decision. He'd taken his Uncle Robert's car without permission and driven to Westminster to pick up Madison. But by the time Danny got to the house, the situation had escalated beyond anything either of them had imagined. My mom. Madison's voice broke. He shot my mom. I heard the gunshot when Danny was pulling into the driveway. We got in the car and drove. We didn't know where to go. Danny said we should go to the police, but I was scared they wouldn't believe us. And then, when we saw your lights, the pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was worse than anything I'd initially imagined. The theft report hadn't come from Robert Cooper reporting his car stolen. It had come from someone else at the house. Maybe a neighbor who'd heard the gunshots, maybe someone who'd witnessed Robert leaving the house with a gun, looking for his daughter. Madison, where's Danny now? Why did he run when I approached the car? He has warrants. Nothing serious, just some unpaid tickets and a missed court date. But he was scared you'd arrest him and leave me alone out here. He said he'd wait in the woods until you took me somewhere safe. I looked around at the dark countryside surrounding us. If Danny was hiding in the Cottonwood Grove, or one of the many ditches and gullies that crisscrossed the area, he could be anywhere within a half-mile radius. And if Robert Cooper was still alive and still looking for his daughter, Danny might be the only witness to what had happened at the house. Madison, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do you know if your father is still alive? Did you see what happened after you left the house? I don't know. After the gunshot, everything was just chaos. Danny grabbed me and we ran to the car. I think I heard Dad yelling, but I couldn't tell if he was yelling at us or at Mom, or I just don't know. My radio crackled to life with a transmission that I'd been dreading, but somehow knew was coming. All units, all units. We have a confirmed homicide at 4247 Maple Street in Westminster. Suspect is Robert James Cooper, considered armed and extremely dangerous. Be advised, suspect may be pursuing his daughter who fled the scene in his vehicle. Madison heard the transmission too, and the sound she made wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of someone's world ending in real time. Her mother was dead. Her father had killed her mother, and now he was coming for Madison. Unit 472, did you copy that transmission? Dispatch, Unit 472, I copied. I have Madison Cooper in custody and she appears to be injured. I also have confirmation that the vehicle was taken by her cousin Daniel Cooper in an attempt to remove her from the scene of the homicide. Request immediate medical assistance and backup for scene security. Unit 472, medical is en route, ETA 6 minutes. Be advised that Robert Cooper has not been located at the Westminster scene, and Westminster PD believes he may be en route to your location. That transmission hit me like a lightning bolt. Robert Cooper was still alive, still armed, and potentially heading toward County Road 27. He knew the area as well as anyone, probably better since it was his car that Danny had driven here. If he'd been tracking his own vehicle using GPS or some kind of app, he might already know exactly where we were. And we were sitting ducks. "Danny," I called out toward the tree line. "Danny Cooper, this is the Colorado State Patrol. I need you to come back here right now. Your cousin needs medical attention and we need to get both of you to safety." There was no response from the darkness. Either Danny was too far away to hear me, or he was too scared to reveal his position. I couldn't blame him either way. From his perspective, he'd stolen a car to help save his cousin's life, and now there were police lights and sirens and radio chatter about homicides and armed suspects. Any 19-year-old with outstanding warrants would be thinking about running at this point, but I needed him back here. Madison was injured and going into shock, and if Robert Cooper showed up looking for revenge, I was going to need all the help I could get. Danny knew his uncle better than I did, which meant he might be able to predict how Robert would approach the situation. "Madison, can you call Danny? Does he have a cell phone?" "Yes, but there's no signal out here. We tried calling 911 when we first stopped, but nothing went through." She was right. I'd been so focused on the radio communications with dispatch that I hadn't thought about cell phone coverage. County Road 27 was in a dead zone where the nearest cell tower was blocked by hills and distance. Danny could be 50 feet away from us, but we had no way to communicate with him except by shouting into the darkness. The sound of approaching sirens broke the night air, growing louder as my backup finally arrived. But instead of relief, I felt a growing sense of urgency. Those sirens could be heard for miles in the quiet countryside, which meant that anyone else who might be heading our way would know exactly where to find us. The first backup unit was Trooper Mike Hendricks, a 20-year veteran who'd worked more high-stress situations than anyone else in our division. His patrol car skidded to a stop behind mine, and he was out and moving toward us before the dust had settled. "Jake, what's the situation?" Missing teenager recovered, injured but conscious, possible broken arm and head trauma. Father is the suspect in a Westminster homicide, may be en route to this location. The girl's cousin who drove her here has fled on foot, probably hiding in the immediate area. Mike nodded grimly and immediately began setting up a defensive perimeter. In situations like this, a standard procedure is to assume the worst-case scenario and prepare accordingly. That meant treating Robert Cooper as an active threat who could arrive at any moment, armed and desperate. "Medical is 3 minutes out," Mike reported. "I've also got 2 more units en route and Westminster PD is sending a detective to coordinate with our investigation." "Mike, there's something else. The cousin who drove her here, Danny Cooper, has warrants. Nothing serious, but he ran when he saw my lights. We need to find him and get him back here before his uncle shows up. Any idea which direction he went? I pointed toward the cottonwood grove. Most likely in there, but he could be anywhere within half a mile. The terrain is rough, lots of places to hide. Mike keyed his radio. Dispatch, Unit 319, requesting K-9 units for a search and recovery operation. We have a potential witness who fled on foot, and we need to locate him before the situation becomes more dangerous. The ambulance arrived just as Madison started to lose consciousness. The combination of shock, blood loss, and probable concussion was finally taking its toll. The paramedics immediately began working to stabilize her while Mike and I continued scanning the surrounding area for any sign of movement. There! Mike pointed toward a section of tall grass about 100 yards from the road. Movement at 11 o'clock. I followed his gaze and saw what looked like someone moving low through the grass, trying to stay hidden but making enough movement to catch our attention. It could be Danny trying to get closer to see what was happening to Madison, or it could be Robert Cooper approaching our position. "Danny Cooper," I called out. "If that's you, you need to identify yourself right now. Your cousin is being taken to the hospital, and we need to talk to you." The movement stopped for a moment, then resumed, but now it was clearly moving toward us rather than away. A few seconds later, a young man's voice called back, "Don't shoot! I'm coming out. Is Madison okay?" Danny Cooper emerged from the grass looking exactly like what he was, a scared 19-year-old who'd gotten in way over his head. He was tall and thin, wearing a University of Colorado sweatshirt and jeans that were now muddy and torn from hiding in the ditch. "Madison's alive?" I told him as he approached with his hands visible. "She's hurt, but the paramedics are taking care of her. Danny, I need you to tell me everything that happened tonight, starting from when Madison called you." What Danny told us confirmed Madison's story but added crucial details that made the situation even more terrifying. When he'd arrived at the Cooper house, he'd seen Robert standing over his wife's body in the living room, reloading a revolver. Robert had looked up and seen Danny through the front window, and for a moment the two of them had just stared at each other. "He knew," Danny said, his voice shaking. "He knew I was there to help Madison get away, and I could see in his eyes that he was going to kill me too if he got the chance." Danny had honked the horn to warn Madison, who'd climbed out her bedroom window and run to the car. But Robert had come outside and fired several shots at the car as they drove away. One of the bullets had hit the rear window, spider-webbing the glass but not penetrating completely. "That's why I was driving so fast," Danny explained. "I thought he might be following us, and when I saw the police lights, I thought maybe he'd called the cops and told them we stole his car." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted Danny's story. But instead of more police cars, what we heard was the distinctive rumble of a powerful engine being pushed hard. Mike and I exchanged glances. We both recognized the sound of someone approaching at high speed on County Road 27. "Get down!" Mike shouted to Danny and the paramedics. "Everyone take cover behind the vehicles." The engine sound grew louder, and then we saw headlights cresting the hill about a mile behind us. Whatever vehicle was approaching was moving fast enough to be airborne over some of the bumps and dips in the road. "Unit 319, we have an unknown vehicle approaching at high speed. Could be our suspect." All units, Robert Cooper is driving a dark blue Ford pickup truck. License number, Charlie Delta 8749. Consider armed and extremely dangerous." The approaching headlights matched the description. Definitely a pickup truck, and definitely moving like someone who had nothing left to lose. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was weaving slightly, either from excessive speed on the rough road or because the driver was impaired by alcohol or adrenaline. "Danny, is that your uncle's truck?" Danny peered around the edge of the ambulance and nodded grimly. "That's him. And if he's driving like that, it means he's completely lost it." The pickup truck crested the final hill and came into view of our position. For a moment, I thought Robert might try to ram one of our vehicles or just drive past us completely. Instead, he slammed on his brakes and came to a skidding stop about 50 yards away from our impromptu roadblock. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The truck's headlights blazed across our position, making it impossible to see what Robert was doing in the cab. But we could hear the engine still running, and we could see exhaust vapor rising in the cold October air. "Robert Cooper!" Mike called out through his patrol car's PA system. "This is the Colorado State Patrol. Step out of the vehicle with your hands visible." The response was immediate and terrifying. The truck's engine revved, and Robert began driving slowly toward our position. Not fast enough to be an obvious attack, but steady and deliberate, like someone who'd made a decision and was seeing it through to the end. "He's not stopping," I said into my radio. "All units, suspect is advancing on our position, preparing defensive measures." What happened next unfolded in slow motion, the way violent confrontations often do when adrenaline kicks in and your perception of time gets distorted. The pickup truck continued its steady approach, and I could finally make out Robert Cooper behind the wheel. He was slumped forward slightly, and even from 50 yards away, I could see dark stains on his shirt that might have been blood. "He's been shot," Danny said suddenly. "Look at him. I think he's bleeding." Danny was right. As the truck got closer, it became obvious that Robert Cooper was badly injured. The question was whether he'd been shot by police at the Westminster scene, or whether he'd tried to kill himself and botch the job the same way he'd apparently botched everything else that night. "Robert!" Danny called out. "Uncle Robert, stop the truck. Madison's alive, she's okay, you don't have to do this." The truck stopped about 20 feet away from us, close enough that we could see Robert's face clearly now, and what we saw explained everything. He wasn't angry or crazed or filled with homicidal rage. He was dying. Robert Cooper had shot himself in the chest, probably right after killing his wife. But instead of dying quickly, he'd survived long enough to realize that Madison had escaped, and he'd spent his last reserves of strength trying to find her. Not to kill her, but to see her one more time before he died. Madison. Robert's voice was weak but audible through the truck's open window. Is my little girl okay?" Danny looked at me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. His uncle had just murdered his aunt, had terrorized Madison and forced them both to flee for their lives. But he was also family, and he was dying, and he was asking about the daughter he'd spent the last of his life trying to find. "She's alive, Uncle Robert. She's hurt, but she's going to be okay." Robert nodded slowly, and I could see tears mixing with the blood on his face. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never meant for any of this to happen." Those were the last words Robert Cooper ever spoke. He slumped forward over the steering wheel, and the truck's horn began a long, mournful wail that echoed across the empty countryside. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had played out that night. Robert Cooper had been struggling with depression and alcoholism for months, triggered by the loss of his job and mounting financial pressures. His wife had been trying to get him help, but he'd refused treatment and had been drinking more heavily as the stress increased. On the night of the murders, Robert had received an eviction notice in the mail. The family was going to lose their house, and in his alcohol-impaired and depressed state, Robert had decided that killing his family and himself was preferable to letting them face homelessness and poverty. But Madison's escape had disrupted his plan. After shooting his wife, Robert had shot himself in the chest, intending to die quickly. When that didn't happen, he'd used his remaining strength to find Madison, not to complete his murder-suicide plan, but to say goodbye to the daughter he'd never see grow up. Danny Cooper was charged with auto theft but received probation due to the extenuating circumstances. He'd stolen a car, but he'd done it to save his cousin's life, and the judge recognized that his actions had prevented an even greater tragedy. Madison Cooper survived her injuries and went to live with relatives in another state. But the trauma of that night changed her in ways that weren't always visible. I saw her at the trial 6 months later, and while she looked physically healthy, there was something different in her eyes. Something that hadn't been there before, and probably never would be again. I still work the midnight shift on Highway 36. I still stop speeders and check on truck stops and drink too much coffee to stay alert. But I never look at a routine traffic stop the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes when you're chasing someone down a dark highway at 3 in the morning, you're not chasing a criminal. Sometimes you're chasing someone who's running for their life, and sometimes the real monster is the one they're running from. And sometimes the most terrifying thing about working midnight patrol isn't what you might encounter in the darkness. It's the knowledge that somewhere out there, in houses with lights on and cars in the driveway, ordinary families are falling apart in ways that will eventually spill out onto your highway. The radio call that started my chase that night came in as a stolen vehicle report. But what I was really responding to was the end of a family, the destruction of a home, and a 17-year-old girl's desperate attempt to survive the worst night of her life. Madison Cooper contacted me about a year later. She was living with relatives in Oregon, going to college, and slowly building a new life away from the shadows of that October night. She wanted to thank me for finding her in the grass and for believing her story when everything seemed to point in a different direction. But here's what she told me that still haunts me. She said that during those terrifying moments when she was hiding in the darkness, listening to my voice calling her name, she thought I might be her father, pretending to be a police officer to lure her out of hiding. That's the level of fear she was operating under. That's how completely her trust in the world had been shattered. She was so terrified of her own father that she'd rather risk bleeding to death in a ditch than take the chance that the voice offering help might be another trap. I think about that conversation every time I approach a traffic stop now. I think about how the people I encounter might be seeing me not as help, but as another potential threat in a world that's already tried to destroy them. The midnight highway is full of secrets, and sometimes those secrets are darker than anything you'd expect to find on a lonely road at 3 in the morning. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the story is the one who never appears in your rearview mirror. Sometimes the real pursuit isn't about catching someone who's running away, it's about understanding why they're running in the first place. Danny Cooper stayed in touch with me for several years after that night. He eventually got his life together, paid off his warrants, and became an EMT. He said that seeing the paramedics work on Madison that night had inspired him to find a way to help people instead of just getting by day to day. It's funny how tragedy can sometimes redirect people toward better paths, even when it seems like it's destroying everything in its wake. But Danny also told me something that I've never been able to shake. About a week before the murders, his uncle Robert had called him out of the blue and asked if Danny thought Madison would be better off without him as a father. Danny had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just Robert being dramatic about his job loss and money problems. But looking back, he realized it had been a warning sign that none of them had recognized. How many other warning signs do we miss? How many other families are one bad day away from the kind of tragedy that played out on County Road 27 that night? These are the questions that keep me awake during my off hours, when I should be sleeping and getting ready for another midnight shift. The Westminster Police Department's investigation revealed that Robert Cooper had purchased the gun he used in the murders only 3 days before the shooting. Colorado has waiting periods for handgun purchases, but Robert had bought a rifle from a private seller at a gun show, which meant there was no background check and no waiting period. The seller later told investigators that Robert had seemed nervous and agitated, but that wasn't unusual for people buying their first firearm. What haunts me about this detail is how close Madison came to never escaping that house. If Robert had bought the gun a week earlier, or if he decided to act on a different night when Danny wasn't available to help, the outcome could have been completely different. Sometimes survival comes down to timing and luck, factors that are completely outside anyone's control. The psychological evaluation that was conducted on Robert Cooper posthumously, based on interviews with family members and co-workers, painted a picture of a man who'd been struggling with mental health issues for months without getting help. His wife had begged him to see a counselor, but he'd refused, saying that real men don't need therapy. It's an attitude that I encounter regularly in my work, and it usually ends badly for everyone involved. But what really gets to me is thinking about Robert's last moments, bleeding out in that pickup truck on a dark country road. He'd destroyed his family, killed the woman he'd promised to protect, and traumatized his daughter in ways that would affect her for the rest of her life. But in those final seconds, all he wanted was to know that Madison was okay. I've tried to make sense of that contradiction for years now, and I still don't understand how someone can simultaneously love their child and terrorize them. How someone can claim to be protecting their family while systematically destroying it. Maybe that's the real horror of domestic violence, the way it corrupts even the most basic human emotions and turns love into something twisted and dangerous. The media coverage of the case focused primarily on the murder-suicide aspect, which meant that Madison's survival story got overshadowed by the more dramatic elements. But for those of us who worked the case, Madison's escape was the most important part of the whole thing. She was 17 years old, had never driven at night before, and had to make life or death decisions while under the most extreme stress imaginable. And she survived. That takes a kind of courage that most adults never have to discover in themselves. Madison didn't just survive because she was lucky, or because Danny happened to answer his phone. She survived because when her world collapsed around her, she found the strength to run toward help instead of giving up and accepting her fate. I think about Madison whenever I encounter other young people who are dealing with family violence or substance abuse or any of the other problems that tend to spill onto the highways during the midnight shift. Sometimes, the difference between survival and tragedy is having someone believe in your ability to escape, even when you don't believe in it yourself. The stretch of County Road 27 where we found Madison looks exactly the same today as it did that October night. The same hills, the same grass, the same cottonwood trees where Danny hid while his cousin fought for her life. But I can't drive past that spot without thinking about everything that happened there, and everything that could have happened if just one or two details had been different. That's another thing about working midnight patrol that they don't teach you in the academy. Certain places become permanently marked in your memory, associated forever with the worst things you've witnessed. You learn to drive past those places and continue doing your job, but you never forget what happened there, and you never stop wondering about all the alternate endings that were possible. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd waited for backup instead of approaching the abandoned Challenger alone. Madison might have bled to death in that grass while I sat in my patrol car following protocol. Or maybe Robert would have found her first, and the story would have ended very differently. But I also wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices during the pursuit itself. What if I'd tried to stop the Challenger earlier, before they reached County Road 27? What if I'd pushed harder to get more information from dispatch before attempting the traffic stop? These are the kind of second-guessing thoughts that can drive a cop crazy if you let them. Every decision you make in a high-stress situation has consequences that ripple outward in ways you can't predict. You do your best with the information you have, and you live with the results, good or bad. In Madison's case, the results were as good as they could have been under the circumstances. She survived, Danny avoided serious legal consequences, and Robert Cooper's suicide meant that he couldn't hurt anyone else. But 2 people were still dead, a family was still destroyed, and a 17-year-old girl still had to rebuild her entire life from scratch. The thing that surprised me most about the aftermath was how the other officers in my unit responded to the case. I'd expected them to focus on the tactical aspects, the pursuit, the weapons involved, the coordination with Westminster PD. Instead, most of them wanted to talk about Madison, and how she'd managed to keep functioning under that level of stress. Mike Hendricks, who'd been my backup that night, told me later that he'd never seen a teenager handle trauma as well as Madison had. Even while she was injured and going into shock, she'd been trying to help us understand what had happened and where to find Danny. Most people, adults included, would have been completely unable to function after experiencing what she'd been through. That observation led to a broader discussion in our unit about how we handle cases involving domestic violence and family trauma. It's easy to focus on the immediate threat and the law enforcement response, but the real work often begins after the sirens stop and the crime scene tape comes down. That's when survivors have to figure out how to rebuild their lives, and that's when they need the most support. Our department started partnering with local social services agencies to make sure that survivors like Madison get connected with counseling and legal assistance and all the other resources they need to move forward. It's not traditional police work, but it's the kind of follow-up that can make the difference between someone recovering from trauma and someone being destroyed by it. Madison's case also changed how we approach high-speed pursuits involving potential kidnapping victims. The Colorado State Patrol now has specific protocols for situations where the suspect and victim might be related, and where the circumstances of the crime aren't immediately clear. We learned that sometimes the person you're chasing is running toward help, not away from it. The most lasting impact of that night, though, has been on how I interact with people during routine traffic stops and welfare checks. You never know what someone is running from, or how much courage it took for them to get as far as they have. Sometimes the person who seems uncooperative or hostile is actually just terrified, and sometimes the person who seems calm and collected is barely holding themselves together. I've probably made thousands of traffic stops since that October night, and I approach every single one of them with the knowledge that the person in that car might be having the worst day of their life. Maybe they're running from something. Maybe they're trying to get help for someone else, or maybe they're just trying to survive until tomorrow. That awareness doesn't make me less effective as a law enforcement officer. If anything, it makes me better at reading situations and understanding when something doesn't fit the usual pattern. It helps me ask the right questions and notice the details that might indicate whether someone is a threat or a victim, or just someone who needs help. The radio in my patrol car still crackles to life with calls about stolen vehicles and missing persons and domestic disturbances. And every time I respond to one of those calls, I think about Madison Cooper and the night that taught me that the most important part of police work isn't catching criminals. It's recognizing when someone needs to be saved. Sometimes the midnight highway brings you face to face with pure evil, the kind of violence and cruelty that makes you question your faith in humanity. But sometimes it brings you face to face with extraordinary courage, the kind of strength that ordinary people find when everything else has been stripped away. Madison Cooper found that kind of strength on the worst night of her life, and she used it to survive when survival seemed impossible. Danny Cooper found it too, when he made the decision to risk everything to help his cousin escape. Even Robert Cooper, in his final moments, found something that might have been love or regret or just basic human decency. That's what I choose to remember about that night. Not the violence or the tragedy or the waste of human life, but the courage that people found when they needed it most. Because in 8 years of working the midnight shift, I've learned that courage is more common than you might expect, and it shows up in the most unlikely places. The pursuit that started at mile marker 43 and ended on County Road 27 lasted less than 30 minutes from start to finish. But its impact on everyone involved, Madison, Danny, the other officers, and even me, has lasted for years and will probably continue for the rest of our lives. That's the reality of working midnight patrol that they don't prepare you for in training. It's not just about enforcing laws and responding to emergencies. It's about being present for the moments when people's lives change forever, and sometimes being the difference between whether those changes lead to hope or despair. And when you're driving down an empty highway at 3 a.m, with only the radio and your own thoughts for company, you carry all of those moments with you. The successful rescues and the tragic failures. The split-second decisions that saved lives and the ones that didn't. The faces of people you helped and people you couldn't help. It's a heavy burden, but it's also a privilege. Not everyone gets to see people at their best and worst, their most courageous and most vulnerable. Not everyone gets the chance to make decisions that can literally mean the difference between life and death for someone else. The night I chased the red Challenger down County Road 27 taught me that those opportunities come without warning, in situations that don't follow any textbook or training manual. All you can do is trust your instincts, use your training, and hope that when the moment comes, you'll have the wisdom to make the right choice. Madison Cooper survived that night because a lot of people made the right choices at the right times. Danny made the right choice when he answered her phone call. I made the right choice when I decided to approach the abandoned car instead of waiting for backup. The paramedics made the right choices when they treated her injuries. The dispatcher made the right choice when she sent multiple units to our location. But Madison survived primarily because she made the right choice herself. The choice to run toward help instead of accepting defeat. That's the kind of courage that inspires everyone around it. And it's the kind of story that reminds you why the work matters, even when everything else seems hopeless. Every time I start my midnight shift now, I check my equipment and review the night's briefing, and head out onto Highway 36 with the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone might be having the worst night of their life. And maybe, if I'm lucky and smart and brave enough, I'll be able to help them find their way to something better. That's what working the midnight shift is really about. It's about being ready for the moment when everything goes wrong for someone else, and being the person who shows up to help them find their way back to safety. And sometimes, that's enough to make all the darkness worth it. The department psychologist who debriefed all of us after the incident told me something that I've carried with me ever since. She said that trauma doesn't just affect the primary victims. It ripples outward like waves in a pond, touching everyone who was involved, even peripherally. The officers who responded, the dispatchers who coordinated the response, the medical personnel who treated Madison, even the tow truck driver who hauled away Robert Cooper's vehicles. We all carry pieces of that night with us, and we all process it differently. Some of the guys threw themselves into their work, picking up extra shifts and volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. Others became more cautious, more methodical in their approach to high-risk situations. A few transferred to different units, or even left law enforcement altogether. For me, the impact was more subtle, but no less profound. I started paying closer attention to the details that might indicate someone was in genuine distress rather than just being uncooperative. I learned to listen for the things people weren't saying, to watch for the signs that someone's story didn't quite match their behavior. That enhanced awareness paid off about 6 months later, when I responded to what seemed like a routine noise complaint at a rural trailer park. The complainant said their neighbor had been playing loud music all night, but when I arrived, I noticed several details that didn't fit. The music was coming from inside the trailer, but there were no cars in the driveway, and no lights on except for the flickering glow of what might have been candles. Most people don't listen to music in the dark, and they definitely don't light candles when they have electricity. Something was wrong. When I knocked on the door, a woman answered who was obviously trying very hard to appear normal. She was polite and apologetic about the music, promised to turn it down immediately, and seemed eager to end our conversation as quickly as possible. But her hands were shaking, and I could see what looked like bruising around her wrists. It took nearly an hour of careful questioning and reassurance, but eventually she broke down and told me that her boyfriend had beaten her unconscious earlier that evening. When she'd woken up, he was gone, but she was afraid he'd come back. She'd been playing the music loud to make it seem like she wasn't alone, and lighting candles because he'd shut off the electricity as punishment for making him angry. If I hadn't learned to trust my instincts during the Madison Cooper case, I might have just told her to turn down the music and left. Instead, I was able to connect her with domestic violence resources and help her get to a safe location before her boyfriend returned. That's the hidden impact of cases like Madison's. They don't just affect the immediate participants, they change how everyone involved approaches their work going forward. They create a ripple effect of increased awareness and sensitivity that can prevent other tragedies down the line. The Colorado State Patrol used Madison's case as a training scenario for new recruits, focusing on the importance of questioning initial assumptions and remaining flexible when situations don't develop as expected. The case study has probably been reviewed by hundreds of officers over the years, and I have to believe that some of them have used those lessons to handle their own complex situations more effectively. But the most significant long-term impact of that night wasn't on law enforcement procedures or training protocols. It was on Madison herself, and on how she chose to rebuild her life after losing everything she'd known. 3 years after the incident, Madison contacted me again with news that surprised me. She was majoring in social work, with a specialization in family crisis intervention. She said that surviving that night had shown her how much difference the right person could make at the right moment. And she wanted to be that person for other families in crisis. I keep thinking about how many warning signs there must have been before that night, she told me during a phone conversation. Mom tried to get Dad help, but he refused. The neighbors heard him yelling and threw furniture around, but nobody called the police. His coworkers knew he was drinking heavily and talking about hopeless everything was, but they just figured it was normal workplace stress. Madison had decided to dedicate her career to identifying and responding to those warning signs before they escalated into violence. She was working with a nonprofit organization that trained community members to recognize the signs of domestic violence and mental health crises, and to connect at-risk families with appropriate resources. The thing is, she explained, most people don't wake up one day and decide to kill their families. There's usually a progression, a series of smaller incidents that build up over time. If you can intervene early enough, before someone reaches that point of no return, you can sometimes prevent the whole tragedy from happening. Her work was having a real impact. The organization she worked with had helped identify and assist more than 200 at-risk families in the 3 years since she'd started, and several of those interventions had likely prevented situations similar to what her own family had experienced. Madison had also become an advocate for changes in how law enforcement and social services respond to domestic violence calls. She argued that, too often, agencies waited for a crime to be committed before taking action, when what was really needed was proactive intervention based on patterns of escalating behavior. When the police came to our house for noise complaints or welfare checks, they were always focused on the immediate situation, she explained. Is anyone hurt right now? Is there evidence of a crime right now? But they weren't looking at the bigger picture, the pattern of incidents that showed things were getting progressively worse. Her advocacy work had contributed to policy changes in several Colorado counties, including new protocols for documenting and tracking domestic disturbance calls, and improved coordination between law enforcement and social services agencies. But perhaps most importantly, Madison had found a way to transform her trauma into purpose. Instead of being defined by the worst thing that had ever happened to her, she'd chosen to use that experience as motivation to help prevent similar tragedies for other families. "I'll never get my parents back," she told me during our last conversation, "and I'll never completely get over what happened that night. But if I can help save even one family from going through what mine did, then maybe some good can come from all that loss." Danny Cooper had found his own way to channel his experience into something positive. After becoming an EMT, he'd specialized in crisis intervention and de-escalation techniques. He'd become the person his unit called when they needed to talk down someone who was having a psychiatric emergency or threatening self-harm. Uncle Robert wasn't a monster, Danny had told me during a conversation about a year after the incident. He was a sick man who didn't get the help he needed. If someone had been able to reach him before he got to that breaking point, maybe everything would have turned out differently. Danny's work as an EMT had given him dozens of opportunities to be that person for others. He'd talked suicidal people down from bridges, convinced overdose victims to accept treatment, and helped police officers safely resolve situations involving people in mental health crises. Every time I respond to one of those calls, I think about that night on County Road 27, he'd said. I think about how scared and desperate Uncle Robert must have been, and how maybe if someone had shown him a different way out, he wouldn't have felt like violence was his only option. The ripple effects of that October night had extended far beyond the immediate participants. The Westminster Police Department had revised their protocols for responding to domestic violence calls, with increased emphasis on identifying families that might be at risk for escalating violence. The Colorado State Patrol had updated their training procedures for high-speed pursuits involving potential kidnapping victims. Even the 911 dispatcher who'd handled the initial call, Sarah Chen, had been affected by the case. She'd taken additional training in crisis communication and had become an advocate for improved mental health resources for emergency services personnel. "We see a lot of tragedy in this job," Sarah had told me. "But there's something about that particular call that stayed with me. Maybe it was because it started out seeming like a routine stolen vehicle report, and by the end of the night we were dealing with murder and suicide and a teenage girl fighting for her life." Sarah had started a support group for dispatchers and other emergency communications personnel, recognizing that they often carried emotional burdens from their work that went unrecognized and untreated. The group had grown to include members from multiple agencies across the Front Range, and had helped dozens of emergency services workers process their own trauma and stress. The case had even affected some of the peripheral players in ways that surprised me. The tow truck driver who'd hauled away Robert Cooper's vehicles had been a friend of Robert's from high school, and learning about the circumstances of Robert's death had prompted him to seek help for his own depression and alcohol problems. The paramedic who'd treated Madison's injuries had been so affected by her courage and resilience that he'd volunteered to become a trainer for other first responders on how to communicate effectively with trauma victims. He'd said that watching Madison maintain her composure and try to help us understand what had happened, even while she was badly injured and in shock, had taught him important lessons about the strength that people can find in their worst moments. But the most unexpected ripple effect came from the neighbor who'd initially called in the stolen vehicle report. Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez lived across the street from the Cooper house, and she'd witnessed Robert leaving with the gun while Madison and Danny were fleeing in the car. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived in that neighborhood for 30 years, and she'd always followed the unwritten rule of minding her own business when it came to her neighbors' private affairs. But watching the Cooper family's tragedy unfold had changed her perspective on the responsibility that community members have to look out for each other. "I saw the signs," she told me during the investigation. "I heard the arguments getting louder and more frequent. I saw Robert stumbling around drunk in his yard at all hours. I knew something was building up to a breaking point, but I told myself it wasn't my business, that I should stay out of other people's problems." After that night, Mrs. Rodriguez had become an activist for community-based violence prevention. She'd organized neighborhood watch groups that focused not just on crime prevention, but on identifying and assisting families that might be in crisis. She'd partnered with local social services agencies to create a network of trained volunteers who could recognize warning signs and connect at-risk families with appropriate resources. "We all live next to each other, but we act like strangers," she'd said during one of the community meetings she'd organized. "If we paid attention to what's really happening in our neighbors' lives, we might be able to prevent tragedies like what happened to the Cooper family." Her efforts had led to the creation of similar programs in neighborhoods throughout the Denver metropolitan area. The programs had identified and assisted hundreds of families dealing with domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health crises, and other risk factors for family violence. The legal aftermath of the case had been relatively straightforward, but it had also created precedents that affected how similar cases were handled throughout Colorado. Danny's auto theft charges had been dropped due to the extenuating circumstances, and the case had established legal precedent for considering family emergency situations when evaluating theft charges involving relatives. The case had also influenced changes in how law enforcement agencies coordinate with each other during multi-jurisdictional incidents. The initial confusion about who had reported the vehicle stolen, and the difficulty in getting accurate information from Westminster PD during the pursuit, had highlighted gaps in communication protocols that were subsequently addressed through improved information sharing systems. Madison's survival and recovery had also influenced medical protocols for treating trauma victims. The paramedics who'd responded that night had noted that Madison's ability to provide coherent information about what had happened, despite her injuries and shock, had been crucial in helping law enforcement understand the full scope of the situation. Their observations had contributed to research on how trauma affects cognitive function, and how medical personnel can better support trauma victims' ability to communicate with law enforcement. The psychological evaluation of Robert Cooper's mental state leading up to the murder-suicide had also contributed to research on risk factors for family violence. The combination of job loss, financial stress, alcohol abuse, and untreated depression that had contributed to Robert's breakdown had been identified in numerous other cases, leading to improved screening protocols for identifying at-risk individuals. But beyond all the policy changes and procedural improvements and research contributions, what stayed with me most from that night was the human element, the courage that ordinary people had found when everything was falling apart around them, the split-second decisions that had meant the difference between life and death, the way that tragedy had ultimately led to positive changes that prevented other tragedies. I think about Robert Cooper sometimes, and I try to imagine what might have happened if he'd made different choices during those crucial days leading up to the murders. What if he'd accepted his wife's pleas to get counseling? What if he'd reached out to family members or friends for help instead of isolating himself? What if he'd chosen to leave the house instead of bringing violence into it? Those alternate scenarios will never be more than speculation, but they remind me that most tragedies aren't inevitable. They're the result of a series of choices and circumstances that build up over time. And there are usually multiple points along the way where different decisions could have led to different outcomes. That knowledge doesn't make the work easier, but it makes it feel more meaningful. Every domestic disturbance call I respond to now is an opportunity to help someone find a different path before they reach the point where violence seems like the only option. Every welfare check is a chance to connect someone with resources that might prevent a crisis from escalating. And every traffic stop, every routine patrol contact, every seemingly mundane interaction is an opportunity to recognize when someone is struggling and to point them toward help before their problems become tragedies. The night shift on Highway 36 continues to bring me face to face with people at their worst moments and their best moments, often simultaneously. The drunk driver who's trying to get home to his family safely. The domestic violence victim who's finally found the courage to leave. The teenager who's running away from an abusive situation. The parent who's driving to the hospital because their child is sick. Each of those encounters is someone's story, and each story has the potential to end in tragedy or hope, depending on the choices that get made in crucial moments. My job is to be present for those moments, to make good decisions when people's lives are hanging in the balance, and to remember that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences. Madison Cooper's story could have ended very differently if any number of things had gone wrong that night. If Danny hadn't answered his phone, if she hadn't made it out of the house before her father found her, if she'd been too scared to call for help when she was lying injured in that field, if I'd waited for backup instead of approaching the abandoned car. But all of those things went right, because people made brave choices at crucial moments. And because of those choices, Madison survived to become someone who prevents other families from experiencing the same tragedy hers did. That's what I carry with me every time I start a midnight shift on Highway 36. The knowledge that someone out there might be having the worst night of their life, and that if I'm prepared and alert and courageous enough, I might be able to help them find their way to something better. The radio still crackles with calls about stolen vehicles and missing persons and domestic disturbances. But now I know that each of those calls represents an opportunity to be part of someone's survival story, to help them find hope when everything seems hopeless. And in 8 years of working the midnight shift, I've learned that hope is more resilient than you might expect. It survives in the most unlikely circumstances, and it shows up in the most unexpected places. Sometimes all it needs is one person who's willing to believe in it, and to fight for it when everyone else has given up. That's what working the midnight patrol really means. It's about being that person at that moment when everything else has gone wrong. And sometimes that's not just enough to make the darkness worth it. It's enough to transform the darkness into something that leads toward light. They say that in law enforcement, you never forget your first dead body. That's not entirely true in my experience. After 15 years working Texas Highway Patrol, I've seen enough fatal accidents and crime scenes that the individual cases start to blur together. What you never forget are the cases that don't make sense, the ones that keep you awake at night trying to piece together what really happened. My name is Sergeant Lucas Hartwell, badge number 281, and I've been working the night shift on Interstate 35 between Austin and San Antonio for most of my career. It's a stretch of highway that sees everything: drug runners heading north from the border, college kids driving drunk between party towns, truckers pushing illegal hours to make delivery deadlines, and families traveling at night to avoid the brutal Texas heat. But in all those years of midnight patrol, I've never encountered anything quite like what happened on the night of November 15th. It started with what should have been a routine abandoned vehicle call and ended with questions that still don't have answers, even 3 years later. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. from a trucker who'd stopped at the rest area near mile marker 189. He reported seeing a white sedan sitting on the shoulder about 2 miles south of his location. Hazard lights flashing, no sign of the driver. In Texas, abandoned vehicles on major highways are treated as potential safety hazards, especially at night when visibility is limited, and drunk drivers might not see a stationary car until it's too late. I was only about 10 minutes away, so I took the call and headed south on I-35. November nights in central Texas can be deceptively cool, and a light fog was starting to form in the low areas near the river bottoms. Visibility wasn't terrible, but it wasn't ideal either, which made the trucker's concern about the abandoned car even more valid. When I spotted the vehicle, my first thought was that it looked wrong somehow. The car was positioned perfectly parallel to the highway, not at an angle like you'd expect from someone who'd pulled over in a hurry due to mechanical problems. The hazard lights were flashing in a steady rhythm, which suggested the battery wasn't dead. And despite being parked on the shoulder of a major interstate at 2 in the morning, all 4 tires were properly inflated, and the car didn't appear to be damaged. The vehicle was a 2020 Honda Accord, white, with current registration stickers and no obvious signs of accident damage. As I pulled up behind it with my emergency lights activated, I called it in to dispatch. Unit 281, I'm on scene with the abandoned vehicle at mile marker 187. White Honda Accord, Texas plates. Bravo Delta, Mike 4793. Vehicle appears to be in good condition, no obvious mechanical issues. Running the plates now. Copy, Unit 281. Be advised the vehicle was reported stolen 3 hours ago from a residence in Buda. Owner is Jennifer Lynn Castellanos, age 34, reported the theft when she discovered her car missing from her driveway around 11 p.m. Stolen vehicle. That changed the dynamic considerably, but it also raised immediate questions. If someone had stolen this car 3 hours ago, why abandon it on the interstate instead of driving it to wherever they'd planned to take it? And why leave the hazard lights on, essentially advertising the car's location to any passing law enforcement? I got out of my patrol car and approached the Honda cautiously. In stolen vehicle recoveries, you never know if the thief might still be in the area, possibly hiding in the car or watching from nearby. The windows were slightly tinted, but I could see that the front seats appeared to be empty. What I found when I looked through the driver's window made my skin crawl. The car was running. Not just unlocked, not just abandoned, it was running, with the keys in the ignition and the gear selector in park. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. The interior was immaculate, as if the car had just been driven off a dealership lot. And sitting on the passenger seat was a woman's purse, open, with what appeared to be cash and credit cards visible inside. Car thieves don't abandon running vehicles with the keys in the ignition and valuables in plain sight. They don't carefully position stolen cars on highway shoulders with hazard lights flashing. And they definitely don't call attention to their crimes by making the abandoned vehicle as visible as possible to passing traffic. I keyed my radio. Dispatch Unit 281. The situation just got a lot more complicated. The vehicle is running, keys in ignition, appears to have been abandoned voluntarily rather than as a result of mechanical failure. There's a purse on the passenger seat with what appears to be cash and credit cards. This doesn't look like a typical stolen vehicle recovery. Copy, Unit 281. Do you want backup for the vehicle search? Affirmative. And I'm going to need contact information for the registered owner. I need to speak with Jennifer Castellanos immediately. While I waited for backup, I walked around the vehicle looking for any clues about what might have happened. The exterior was clean, except for the usual road dust you'd expect from highway driving. No dents, no scratches, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The trunk was locked, but I could see through the rear window that it appeared to be empty. The ground around the car told a different story. In the sandy soil of the highway shoulder, I could make out what appeared to be footprints leading away from the driver's side door. The prints were small, consistent with women's shoes, and they headed north along the shoulder for about 20 yards before disappearing into the grass and scrub brush that lined the highway. Someone had gotten out of this car and walked away into the darkness. But why? Trooper Amanda Reyes arrived as my backup, and together we began a more thorough examination of the scene. Amanda had been working highway patrol for 8 years and had a reputation for noticing details that other officers missed. She was also one of the best officers I'd ever worked with when it came to reading people and situations. "Lucas, look at this," Amanda called from the passenger side of the car. She was pointing at something on the seat next to the purse. What she'd found was a cell phone, obviously expensive, lying face down on the leather seat. When she carefully turned it over using a pen to avoid contaminating potential fingerprints, we could see that the screen was cracked, as if it had been dropped or thrown. Someone was in a hurry, Amanda observed. You don't leave a $1,000 phone in a car unless you're running from something. The phone was locked, but we could see missed call notifications on the lock screen. 17 missed calls, all from the same number, starting at 11:47 p.m. and continuing until 2:03 a.m. Someone had been desperately trying to reach whoever owned this phone for over 3 hours. Dispatch Unit 281. We're going to need a CSI unit out here for evidence collection. This is looking less like a stolen vehicle and more like a missing person case. Also requesting immediate contact with Jennifer Castellanos and requesting she respond to our location if possible. Copy. Unit 281. CSI is en route. ETA about 45 minutes. We're attempting to contact Ms. Castellanos now. Amanda and I established a perimeter around the vehicle and began searching the immediate area for any additional evidence. The footprints we'd found led north along the shoulder for about 50 yards before the trail disappeared in an area where the ground was too hard to hold impressions. But we found something else that made the situation even more disturbing. About 30 yards from the car, hidden in tall grass just beyond the highway right-of-way, Amanda discovered a pair of women's shoes. They were black heels, expensive-looking, the kind you'd wear to a nice restaurant or business meeting. They'd been placed side by side, not dropped or scattered as you'd expect if someone had been running. She took her shoes off intentionally, Amanda said, crouching beside them. These weren't lost while she was fleeing. She stopped, took them off, and placed them here. That detail sent chills down my spine. If someone was running from danger, they might kick off high heels to move faster, but they wouldn't stop to arrange them neatly in the grass. That suggested a level of deliberation that didn't fit with an emergency situation. Amanda, start expanding the search pattern. If she was walking in bare feet, she might not have gotten very far. And if she was planning something, I didn't finish the sentence, but we both understood what I was implying. Sometimes people abandon their cars and walk into isolated areas because they're planning to hurt themselves. The careful positioning of the vehicle, the abandoned phone, the neatly placed shoes, it all could point towards someone preparing for suicide. My radio crackled to life. Unit 281, this is dispatch. We've made contact with Jennifer Castellanos. She's en route to your location and should arrive within 30 minutes. She also provided some additional information that might be relevant to your situation. Go ahead, dispatch. Ms. Castellanos states that she did not report her vehicle stolen. She's been trying to contact her sister Elena Castellanos, age 29, who borrowed the car earlier this evening. Elena has not returned her calls and did not return home as expected. Ms. Castellanos is concerned that her sister may be in some kind of trouble. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was troubling. Elena Castellanos had borrowed her sister's car and then disappeared somewhere along Interstate 35 in the middle of the night. She'd abandoned a running vehicle with her purse and phone inside, removed her shoes, and walked into the darkness. Dispatch, I need immediate information on Elena Castellanos. Any history of mental health issues, domestic violence, drug problems, anything that might explain why she'd abandon a vehicle and disappear on foot. Stand by, Unit 281. While we waited for more information, Amanda and I continued searching the area. The terrain alongside I-35 in this area was typical Central Texas scrubland. Mesquite trees, prickly pear cactus, and patches of tall grass broken by limestone outcroppings and dry creek beds. It was the kind of landscape where someone could easily get lost or injured, especially if they were walking barefoot in the dark. But it was also the kind of landscape where someone could hide if they were trying to avoid being found. "Lucas, over here." Amanda's voice carried a note of urgency that made me jog toward her position. She was standing at the edge of a dry creek bed about 100 yards from the highway. The creek was only about 6 feet deep, but the sides were steep and rocky. At the bottom, partially hidden by overhanging brush, was what appeared to be a piece of clothing. I scrambled down into the creek bed and found a woman's blouse. White silk, expensive. It had been torn, not cut, and there were what appeared to be small bloodstains on the fabric. But the disturbing part wasn't the blood. It was the fact that the blouse had been carefully folded and placed on a flat rock, not dropped or discarded carelessly. "She's leaving a trail," Amanda called down to me. "Like breadcrumbs, the shoes, now the blouse. She wants someone to follow her." That realization changed everything. This wasn't someone fleeing in panic or someone who'd impulsively decided to harm themselves. This was someone who was deliberately creating a trail of evidence. Someone who wanted to be found. But why? My radio came alive with information from dispatch. "Unit 281. We have background information on Elena Castellanos. No criminal history, no known mental health issues. However, she filed a domestic violence report 6 months ago against her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Webb. The case was dropped when Ms. Castellanos declined to press charges. Marcus Webb has an extensive criminal history, including assault, stalking, and violation of protective orders." The domestic violence angle added a new dimension to the situation. If Elena was being stalked or threatened by her ex-boyfriend, her behavior might make more sense. Maybe she was trying to lead him away from populated areas to protect other people. Or maybe she was trying to create evidence that would implicate him if something happened to her. "Dispatch, I need immediate information on Marcus Webb's current whereabouts. If he's been stalking Elena Castellanos, he might be involved in her disappearance." "Copy, Unit 281. We're running that information now." CSI arrived just as we were processing this new information. Crime scene investigator Patricia Moon was a 15-year veteran who specialized in missing person cases. She immediately took charge of evidence collection while Amanda and I continued searching for additional clues. "Based on what you've found so far," Patricia told us after examining the scene, "this looks like someone who's either being pursued or is trying to stage evidence. The careful placement of items suggests deliberation, not panic, but the torn clothing and blood traces suggest some kind of violence or struggle." Jennifer Castellanos arrived while Patricia was photographing the evidence. She was a woman in her mid-30s, well-dressed despite being woken up in the middle of the night, and visibly distraught about her sister's disappearance. "Elena borrowed my car to go to dinner with friends," Jennifer explained. "She was supposed to be back by midnight. When I woke up at 2 a.m. and saw she wasn't home, I tried calling her phone. It kept going straight to voicemail. I was about to call the police myself when you called me." "Jennifer, can you tell us about Elena's relationship with Marcus Webb? We understand there was a domestic violence incident 6 months ago." Jennifer's expression darkened immediately. "Marcus has been stalking Elena ever since she broke up with him. The restraining order didn't stop him. He shows up at her work, follows her when she goes out with friends, calls her constantly from different phone numbers. Elena was terrified of him, but the police said they couldn't do anything unless he actually hurt her. Has Elena mentioned seeing Marcus recently? Any indication that the stalking was escalating?" "Last week, Elena found her car windows broken in the parking lot at her apartment complex. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing stolen, just the windows smashed. She was sure it was Marcus, but she couldn't prove it. That's why she's been staying with me for the past few days." The pattern was becoming clearer. Marcus Webb had been escalating his stalking behavior, and Elena had been trying to stay safe by staying with her sister. But something had happened tonight that had forced her to flee, leaving behind a trail that would lead investigators to whatever Webb had done to her. "Jennifer, I need you to think carefully. When Elena left tonight, did she seem nervous or scared? Did she mention anything about meeting Marcus or anyone else? She was going to dinner with her co-workers from the hospital. Elena's a surgical nurse at South Austin Medical Center. It was supposed to be a celebration because she'd just been promoted to charge nurse. She was excited, happy. There was no indication that anything was wrong." My radio interrupted our conversation. "Unit 281, we have urgent information. Marcus Webb was released from Travis County Jail this afternoon after serving 30 days for violation of a protective order. His release conditions included staying away from Elena Castellanos, but he has not reported to his probation officer as required. Released this afternoon." That meant Webb had been free for less than 12 hours before Elena disappeared. It also meant he'd violated his probation conditions by failing to report, which suggested he'd never intended to comply with the terms of his release. "Dispatch, I need an immediate BOLO on Marcus Webb. Consider him armed and dangerous, wanted for questioning and a possible kidnapping. Also, need immediate surveillance on all known associates and previous addresses." "Copy, Unit 281. BOLO is being issued now." Amanda had continued searching while I spoke with Jennifer, and she called out from a position about 200 yards north of where we'd found the blouse. "Lucas, I found something else, and it's not good." I left Jennifer with Patricia and jogged toward Amanda's position. She was standing next to a cluster of mesquite trees, shining her flashlight on something that made my blood run cold. It was another piece of clothing. Elena's jeans, torn and bloody, hanging from a tree branch about 6 feet off the ground. But unlike the carefully placed shoes and folded blouse, the jeans had been thrown or caught on the branch, suggesting they'd been removed forcibly. "There are signs of a struggle here," Amanda pointed out, illuminating disturbed ground and broken branches around the base of the tree. "And look at this." She directed her flashlight beam to the ground, where we could clearly see 2 sets of footprints in the sandy soil. One set was small and bare, consistent with a woman walking without shoes. The other set was larger, made by boots or heavy shoes, and showed signs of a person running or moving quickly. "He caught up with her here," I said, studying the scene. "Elena was trying to lead him away from the highway, but he overtook her at this location." But there was something else at the scene that didn't fit the pattern of violent pursuit. Carved into the bark of one of the mesquite trees, about chest high, were letters that appeared to have been made with a knife or other sharp object. Help me, E.C. Elena Castellanos had taken the time to carve a message into the tree, which suggested that whatever was happening to her wasn't happening quickly. Webb had caught her, but he hadn't immediately killed her or taken her away from the area. Instead, something had occurred that gave her time to leave another deliberate clue. Amanda, expand the search pattern again. If Elena was able to carve a message, she might have had time to leave other evidence. And if Webb is holding her somewhere in this area, we need to find them before he decides to move her to a secondary location. We called for additional units and K-9 support, and within an hour we had 8 officers combing the scrubland alongside Interstate 35. The area was more extensive than it appeared from the highway, with numerous gullies, limestone caves, and abandoned structures that could serve as hiding places. But it was the dogs that led us to the next clue. A German shepherd named Rex, handled by Officer David Martinez, picked up a scent trail that led from the mesquite tree cluster toward an area of broken limestone formations about half a mile from the highway. The limestone formations were typical of Central Texas geology, weathered rock that had been carved by thousands of years of water erosion into a maze of caves and crevices. It was the perfect place to hide someone, but it was also dangerous terrain for a search operation, especially in the dark. We need to approach this carefully, I told the search team. If Webb is holding Elena in one of these caves, we don't want to spook him into doing something desperate. But we also can't wait until daylight if she's injured. Officer Martinez and Rex led us to a cave opening that was partially concealed by overhanging vegetation. The opening was large enough for a person to enter, but narrow enough that someone could easily defend it if they were armed. Rex's behavior indicated that the scent trail led directly into the cave. Hello? This is the Texas Highway Patrol. If anyone is in there, please identify yourself. No response. But as we listened carefully, we could hear what sounded like muffled voices coming from somewhere inside the cave system. Elena? Elena Castellanos? If you're in there, we're here to help you. This time, we heard what was unmistakably a woman's voice, weak but audible. Help. Please help me. That was all we needed. Amanda and I, along with Officers Martinez and Rodriguez, entered the cave with weapons drawn and flashlights ready. The cave system was more extensive than we'd expected, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. We found them in the 3rd chamber, about 50 feet from the entrance. Elena Castellanos was alive, but in bad shape, tied to a limestone formation with rope, badly beaten, and wearing only her underwear and a torn t-shirt that appeared to belong to her captor. Marcus Webb was sitting against the opposite wall of the cave, unconscious, with what appeared to be a severe head injury. Elena, we're police officers. You're safe now. Can you tell us what happened? Elena was conscious but disoriented, probably suffering from a concussion in addition to her other injuries. Marcus, he was waiting for me when I left the restaurant. He had a gun, made me drive here, said he was going to kill me where nobody would find my body. Where's the gun now, Elena? Is Marcus armed? I hit him with a rock when he was trying to... Elena couldn't finish the sentence, but we understood what she was telling us. The gun is over there, behind him. I think I might have killed him. Amanda checked Webb's pulse while I called for medical assistance and additional backup. Webb was alive but unconscious, with a significant head wound that was bleeding heavily. Elena had fought back with the only weapon available to her, a piece of limestone, and had managed to incapacitate her attacker. Elena, you did what you had to do to survive. Marcus is alive and you're going to be okay. Medical help is on the way. As we waited for the paramedics to arrive, Elena told us the full story of what had happened that night. Marcus had been waiting in the parking lot of the restaurant where she'd had dinner with her co-workers. When she'd come out to her sister's car, he'd approached with a gun and forced her to drive to this remote location. He said he'd been planning this for weeks, Elena explained as Amanda worked to untie her restraints. He knew I'd been staying with Jennifer, so he'd been watching the restaurant, waiting for me to go somewhere alone. He said if he couldn't have me, nobody could. Webb had forced Elena to drive to the limestone formations because he'd scouted the area previously and knew it was isolated and difficult to search. His plan had been to assault and kill her, then leave her body in the cave where it might not be found for months or years. But Elena had been smarter and stronger than Webb had anticipated. She'd deliberately left the car running and positioned it to attract attention from passing traffic. She'd created a trail of evidence leading from the highway to the cave, gambling that law enforcement would find the clues and follow them before Webb could complete his plan. I knew someone would find the car eventually, she said. I was trying to leave enough evidence that you'd be able to track down what happened to me, even if you found me too late. Elena's quick thinking and courage had saved her life. But it had been a close thing. The doctors later determined that she'd suffered a severe concussion, multiple contusions, and signs of sexual assault. If we'd arrived even an hour later, the outcome might have been very different. Marcus Webb survived his injuries and was charged with kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and violation of a protective order. The investigation revealed that he'd been planning the attack for weeks, conducting surveillance on Elena's movements and identifying the remote location where he intended to kill her. But the case had implications that extended far beyond the immediate crime. Elena's experience highlighted the inadequacy of existing legal protections for stalking victims and the difficulty law enforcement faces in preventing violence by repeat offenders who are skilled at evading detection. The domestic violence unit at our department used Elena's case as a training example for officers learning to recognize the warning signs of escalating stalking behavior. Her survival strategy, leaving a deliberate trail of evidence, was incorporated into safety planning protocols for other victims of stalking and domestic violence. Elena herself became an advocate for improved legal protections for stalking victims. She testified before the Texas legislature in support of legislation that would strengthen penalties for stalking and provide additional resources for victim protection. Her testimony was instrumental in passing new laws that made it easier for law enforcement to intervene before stalking escalated to violence. The system failed me, Elena told the legislative committee. Marcus violated his protective order repeatedly, and nothing happened. He escalated his behavior for months, and nobody could stop him until he actually kidnapped and assaulted me. We need laws that allow police to act before victims are hurt, not after. The legislation that resulted from Elena's advocacy, known as the Elena Castellanos Act, expanded the definition of stalking to include digital harassment and surveillance, increased penalties for repeat offenders, and provided funding for specialized stalking investigation units. But perhaps most importantly, Elena's case changed how our department approaches abandoned vehicle calls on the highway. We now treat every abandoned vehicle as a potential crime scene until proven otherwise, and we've developed protocols for recognizing when someone might be leaving a deliberate trail of evidence. Those protocols have already been used successfully in several other cases. About a year after Elena's case, we responded to an abandoned vehicle call that initially appeared to be a routine breakdown. But the officers who responded recognized signs similar to what we'd found in Elena's case. Personal items placed deliberately, evidence of someone leaving the vehicle voluntarily, and a trail leading away from the highway. In that case, The trail led to a woman who'd been abducted from a shopping center parking lot and was being held in a rural trailer by her captor. Like Elena, she'd managed to leave clues that led to her rescue before she could be seriously harmed. The psychological impact of Elena's case affected everyone who worked on it. Amanda Reyes, who'd been instrumental in finding and following Elena's trail of evidence, became a specialist in missing person investigations and developed training programs that have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across Texas. Patricia Moon, the CSI investigator, said that Elena's case taught her to look for patterns of deliberate evidence placement that might indicate a victim was trying to communicate with law enforcement. She's since applied those techniques to dozens of other cases, helping to solve crimes that might otherwise have remained unsolved. Even Officer Martinez and his canine partner Rex were affected by the case. The experience of tracking Elena's scent through difficult terrain to ultimately save her life reinforced the importance of their specialized skills, and they've since been involved in numerous successful search and rescue operations. For me personally, Elena's case was a reminder that sometimes the most important police work happens not during high-speed chases or dramatic arrests, but during the careful investigation of seemingly routine calls. The difference between life and death for Elena Castellanos came down to recognizing that her abandoned car wasn't what it appeared to be, and following the trail of evidence she'd courageously left for us to find. I still patrol Interstate 35 on the midnight shift, and I still respond to abandoned vehicle calls on a regular basis. But now, I approach each of those calls with the knowledge that someone might be trying to communicate with me through the evidence they've left behind. Sometimes a car on the shoulder is just a car with mechanical problems, but sometimes it's the beginning of a rescue operation that will save someone's life. The stretch of highway where we found Elena's car has been designated as a safe haven zone, with increased patrol coverage and emergency call boxes installed at regular intervals. The limestone cave where we found Elena has been sealed to prevent it from being used by other criminals, but a small memorial plaque has been placed nearby to honor Elena's courage and the importance of never giving up hope. Elena Castellanos recovered from her physical injuries and returned to work as a charge nurse at South Austin Medical Center. She also married one of the detectives who worked on her case. Not a romantic development that anyone expected, but a relationship that grew out of their shared commitment to helping other victims of violent crime. Marcus Webb was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his trial, evidence was presented showing that he'd been planning Elena's murder for months and had previously stalked and threatened at least 3 other women. Elena's case was the culmination of a pattern of escalating violence that might have continued if she hadn't been brave enough to fight back and smart enough to leave a trail that led to her rescue. But the most lasting impact of Elena's case has been the changes it brought to how law enforcement, social services, and the legal system respond to stalking and domestic violence. The protocols and training programs that resulted from her experience have been used to protect hundreds of other potential victims, and to solve crimes that might otherwise have gone unsolved. The night shift on Interstate 35 continues to bring me into contact with people at the worst moments of their lives. But Elena's case taught me that sometimes those worst moments are also opportunities for extraordinary courage and survival. Sometimes people find strength they didn't know they had, and sometimes that strength is enough to save not just their own lives, but the lives of others who might face similar dangers in the future. Every abandoned vehicle call I respond to now carries the possibility that someone is trying to tell me a story through the evidence they've left behind. And every time I find that evidence and follow that trail, I remember Elena Castellanos and the night she turned what should have been her final hours into the first chapter of a survival story that continues to inspire and protect others years later. The radio still crackles with routine calls about disabled vehicles and traffic hazards. But now I know that sometimes those routine calls are anything but routine, and that the difference between tragedy and triumph often comes down to recognizing when someone is trying to communicate with you through the only means they have available. In 15 years of working highway patrol, I've learned that the midnight shift brings you face to face with both the worst and the best of human nature. Sometimes those encounters happen in the same case, involving the same people at the same time. Helena Castellanos' story was one of those cases, a story about the evil that people can do to each other, but also about the courage and intelligence that can overcome that evil when someone refuses to give up hope. And sometimes, on the loneliest stretch of highway at the darkest hour of the night, that refusal to give up hope is enough to save a life and change the world for the better. In 22 years of law enforcement, I've responded to missing officer calls, officer down situations, and searches that ended with funerals instead of homecomings. But I've never encountered anything that haunted me quite like the disappearance of Officer Rebecca "Becca" Chen from the Nevada Highway Patrol. Even now, 5 years later, her case remains officially open, and the questions it raised about what really happened that night continue to eat at everyone who worked it. My name is Captain Michael Torres, and I was the shift supervisor on duty the night Becca vanished from Highway 95 between Las Vegas and Reno. It's a desolate stretch of desert highway that sees more than its share of strange incidents: drug runners, human traffickers, UFO enthusiasts, and people trying to disappear in the vastness of the Nevada wilderness. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what happened on March 3rd, when one of my best officers made her last radio transmission and then vanished without a trace. Officer Rebecca Chen, badge number 447, had been with the Nevada Highway Patrol for 6 years. She was 31 years old, a former military police officer who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to work civilian law enforcement. Becca was exactly the kind of officer you wanted working the midnight shift on isolated highways. Smart, tough, experienced, and absolutely unflappable under pressure. The night shift on Highway 95 north of Las Vegas is not for rookie officers or anyone who spooks easily. The highway cuts through some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in North America, with stretches where the nearest backup might be an hour away and cell phone coverage is non-existent. Officers working that route need to be self-sufficient and capable of handling dangerous situations alone until help can arrive. Becca had been working Highway 95 for 3 years and knew every mile of it better than most people know their own neighborhoods. She understood the terrain, the weather patterns, the types of people who traveled that route at different times of night, and the dozens of dirt roads and mining tracks that branched off into the desert. If anyone could handle whatever the Nevada wilderness might throw at them, it was Rebecca Chen. That's what made her disappearance so disturbing. Becca wasn't the type of officer who got lost, made rookie mistakes, or found herself in situations she couldn't handle. She was methodical, careful, and always followed proper radio protocols. When she went missing, it wasn't because she'd made an error in judgment or taken an unnecessary risk. The night started normally enough. Becca had checked in at the beginning of her shift at 10 p.m., reporting clear weather and light traffic on her assigned patrol sector between mile markers 87 and 134. It was a Tuesday night in early March, still cold in the high desert but clear, with good visibility and no unusual weather conditions. For the first 4 hours of her shift, Becca's radio transmissions followed the standard pattern: check-ins every 30 minutes, a couple of routine traffic stops, one assist to a motorist with a flat tire near mile marker 102. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would suggest she was about to encounter a situation that would end with her disappearance. Her last routine transmission came at 2:17 a.m. Unit 447 to dispatch, conducting patrol check at mile marker 118, all clear, no traffic. 18 minutes later, at 2:35 a.m., everything changed. Dispatch, Unit 447, I have a... Wait, that's not right. Dispatch, I'm seeing something that doesn't make sense. I'm going to investigate and report back. That transmission was the beginning of the end. Dispatcher Carol Williams, who'd been working with our department for 15 years, later said that Becca's voice sounded puzzled but not alarmed. Whatever she was seeing, it was unexpected, but not immediately threatening. Unit 447, dispatch copies. Can you describe what you're observing? Dispatch, I'm approximately 2 miles north of mile marker 118. I'm seeing what appears to be, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm seeing a vehicle that shouldn't be here. It's a late model sedan, parked off the shoulder, but there's something wrong with it. The car appears to be, I need to get closer to confirm what I'm seeing. Unit 447, do you need backup for the vehicle investigation? Negative, dispatch. I think this might be an abandoned vehicle or possibly a breakdown. I'm going to approach and assess. We'll report back in 5 minutes. That was at 2:37 a.m. Becca never reported back. When she missed her scheduled check-in at 3 a.m., dispatch attempted to raise her on the radio. No response. They tried again at 3:05, 3:10, and 3:15. Nothing. At 3:20 a.m., dispatch contacted me as shift supervisor to report that they'd lost communication with Unit 447. I was patrolling Highway 15 south of Las Vegas when the call came in. The moment I heard that Becca had missed her check-in and wasn't responding to radio calls, I knew something was seriously wrong. In 6 years with the department, Rebecca Chen had never missed a scheduled transmission. Never. Dispatch, this is Captain Torres. I'm en route to Unit 447's last known position. Notify all available units for search and assist. Also contact the Clark County Sheriff's Department and request helicopter support. Copy, Captain Torres. Last transmission from Unit 447 was at 2:37 a.m., reporting investigation of a suspicious vehicle approximately 2 miles north of mile marker 118. I pushed my patrol car hard across the desert, using every shortcut I knew to reach Highway 95. Other units were converging from different directions, but I was closest to Becca's last known position. The drive gave me too much time to think about all the things that could go wrong for a lone officer in that remote area. Highway 95, north of Las Vegas, passes through territory that's home to drug smugglers, illegal weapons dealers, human traffickers, and various other criminals who prefer to operate far from populated areas. The desert is also full of abandoned mine shafts, hidden caves, and other natural hazards that could seriously injure or trap someone who wasn't familiar with the terrain. But Becca was familiar with the terrain. She'd been patrolling that stretch of highway for 3 years, and she was too experienced to get herself into a situation she couldn't handle. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't the result of carelessness or inexperience. When I reached mile marker 118 and started looking for Becca's patrol car, what I found didn't make any sense. There was no patrol car. More specifically, there was no sign that a patrol car had ever been in the area. No tire tracks in the sandy shoulder. No evidence of a vehicle leaving the highway. No indication that Unit 447 had stopped anywhere near mile marker 118. I drove slowly north along the highway, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of Becca's car or the suspicious vehicle she'd reported investigating. At mile marker 120, I found something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on the shoulder, exactly where Becca had described seeing a suspicious vehicle, was a late model sedan. Dark blue Honda Civic, Nevada plates. parked neatly off the roadway with no signs of damage or mechanical problems. The car was unlocked, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, cell phone plugged into the charger. But there was no sign of the driver, and more importantly, there was no sign of Officer Rebecca Chen or her patrol car. I called it in immediately. Dispatch, Captain Torres at mile marker 120. I've located a suspicious vehicle matching the description from Unit 447's last transmission. Dark blue Honda Civic appears to be abandoned. No sign of Unit 447 or Officer Chen. Request immediate backup and search coordination. Copy, Captain Torres. Multiple units en route. ETA 15 minutes. Helicopter support is airborne. While I waited for backup, I examined the Honda more carefully. The vehicle was registered to Sarah Mitchell, age 28, from Henderson, Nevada. According to the registration, Sarah was a nurse at Sunrise Hospital in Las Vegas. Her purse contained her driver's license, credit cards, about $60 in cash, and various personal items. Nothing appeared to be missing. But there were details about the car that didn't fit with a simple breakdown or abandonment. The fuel tank was nearly full. The engine started immediately when I turned the key, and there were no mechanical problems that would have forced someone to stop. The car had been parked deliberately, not abandoned due to emergency. More disturbing was what I found in the trunk. Sarah Mitchell's suitcase, packed with clothes and personal items as if she'd been planning a trip, but also a handwritten note that read, "If something happens to me, Marcus Kellerman is responsible. He's been following me and threatening me for weeks. I'm scared for my life. Marcus Kellerman." The name meant nothing to me, but the note suggested that Sarah Mitchell had been fleeing from someone when she'd stopped on Highway 95. The question was, where was Sarah now? And what connection did her disappearance have to Officer Chen's vanishing? As backup units arrived and we established a search perimeter around the Honda, I kept expecting to find some sign of Becca's patrol car. But after 2 hours of searching, we'd found nothing. No tire tracks, no vehicle parts, no personal items, nothing that would indicate a highway patrol unit had ever been in the area. It was as if Officer Rebecca Chen and Unit 447 had simply vanished from existence. The helicopter search was equally frustrating. Flying in expanding circles from mile marker 120, the crew found no trace of a missing patrol car or any sign of either missing person. The desert stretched in all directions, broken by distant mountains and scattered vegetation, but revealing no secrets about what had happened that night. By dawn, we had a full-scale missing officer investigation underway. The FBI was notified, additional helicopters were brought in, and search teams with dogs were combing the desert on foot. But as the hours passed without any sign of Becca or her car, the situation became more mysterious rather than clearer. The investigation into Sarah Mitchell's background revealed that she'd been the victim of escalating stalking by her ex-boyfriend, Marcus Kellerman. Sarah had filed multiple police reports over the past 3 months, documenting threatening phone calls, vandalism to her car, and incidents where Marcus had followed her to work and other locations. Marcus Kellerman had a criminal history that included domestic violence, stalking, and violation of protective orders with previous girlfriends. He was unemployed, lived alone in a trailer park north of Las Vegas, and had been arrested twice in the past year for violating the restraining order that Sarah had obtained against him. When detectives went to Marcus's trailer to question him about Sarah's disappearance, they found that he was also missing. His neighbors said they hadn't seen him for several days, and his trailer showed signs of hasty departure. Clothing and personal items scattered around, food left out to spoil, and his truck missing from the driveway. The working theory that emerged from the early investigation was that Marcus had followed Sarah onto Highway 95, possibly forced her to stop, and then abducted her. Officer Chen had somehow encountered this situation while conducting her patrol, and had either been taken hostage or harmed while trying to intervene. But that theory had significant problems. If Marcus had abducted Sarah from Highway 95, why leave her car behind with all her personal belongings intact? If he'd harmed Officer Chen during the abduction, where was her patrol car? And how had he managed to overpower an experienced military veteran who was armed and trained for exactly these types of situations? The search for Becca continued for 6 days, involving hundreds of personnel and covering thousands of square miles of desert. We found Marcus Kellerman's truck on the 4th day, abandoned in a wash about 20 miles from where Sarah's car had been discovered. The truck had run out of gas and been left in a location where it was unlikely to be found by casual travelers. Inside the truck, investigators found evidence that Sarah Mitchell had been held captive. Rope with traces of her DNA, duct tape with her fingerprints, and blood traces that matched her blood type. But there was no evidence that Officer Chen had ever been in the truck, and no clues about where Marcus might have taken his victims. The discovery of Marcus's truck led to an intensive search of the surrounding area, but the desert yielded no additional clues. It was as if Marcus Kellerman had simply walked away from his truck and disappeared, taking Sarah Mitchell and potentially Officer Chen with him. On the 7th day of the search, we found Sarah Mitchell. She was discovered by a search team working in a remote canyon about 15 miles from where her car had been abandoned. Sarah was alive but in critical condition, severely dehydrated, suffering from exposure, and showing signs of physical assault. She'd been tied up and left in a shallow cave, apparently abandoned by her captor when the search operation intensified. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, where she spent 3 days in intensive care before she was stable enough to be interviewed. When she finally was able to talk, her story added new pieces to the puzzle, but also raised more disturbing questions about what had happened to Officer Chen. According to Sarah, Marcus had been following her when she left work at the hospital around midnight. She'd realized she was being stalked and had tried to lose him by taking Highway 95 north, hoping to reach the Reno area where she had friends who could help her. But Marcus had caught up with her and forced her to pull over by ramming her car from behind. He had a gun, Sarah told investigators. He made me get out of my car and into his truck. He said he was going to take me somewhere in the desert where nobody would ever find me, and that he was going to make me pay for getting the restraining order. Marcus had driven Sarah to the remote canyon where she was eventually found, but he'd kept her tied up in his truck for most of the first night while he scouted for a good place to hide her. During that time, they'd driven around the desert for hours, with Marcus becoming increasingly paranoid about being followed or discovered. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus saw police lights in his rearview mirror, Sarah continued. He went crazy, started screaming about how the cops were going to ruin everything. He pulled off the road and hid behind some rocks, but the police car kept driving and disappeared. That sighting would have corresponded with the time when Officer Chen was conducting her investigation of Sarah's abandoned car. But according to Sarah, Marcus had only seen the police lights from a distance and hadn't had any direct contact with law enforcement that night. Marcus was obsessed with the idea that the police were tracking him, Sarah explained. Even after the police car disappeared, he kept talking about how they were probably setting up roadblocks and organizing search teams. That's when he decided to leave me in the cave and run. Sarah's account explained what had happened to her, but it didn't explain what had happened to Officer Chen. If Marcus had seen Becca's patrol car from a distance, but hadn't encountered her directly, then Becca's disappearance was still a complete mystery. The investigation took a new direction when Sarah mentioned something that hadn't been in her initial statement. While Marcus was moving her from his truck to the cave where he planned to leave her, she'd seen something in the distance that had seemed out of place at the time. There was another car parked way off in the desert, maybe a mile away from where Marcus left me. It looked like a police car, but it was just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, not near any road. I couldn't figure out why a police car would be parked out there. Sarah's description of the location led search teams to a new area that hadn't been thoroughly examined during the initial search. The terrain was extremely rough, accessible only by foot or off-road vehicles, and located several miles from the nearest road. It took 2 days of searching, but they found it. Unit 447, Officer Rebecca Chen's patrol car, was parked in a narrow canyon surrounded by high rock walls. The car was undamaged and appeared to have been driven to that location deliberately rather than ending up there as the result of an accident. But there was no sign of Officer Chen. The condition of the patrol car raised more questions than it answered. The engine was off, but the keys were still in the ignition. Becca's radio was set to the correct frequency and appeared to be functioning normally. Her service weapon was missing from its holster, but her backup weapon was still in its ankle holster, suggesting she'd had time to draw her primary weapon before whatever happened to her occurred. Most puzzling was the patrol car's computer system, which showed that Becca had run several license plate checks in the hours before her disappearance. The checks included Sarah Mitchell's Honda and Marcus Kellerman's truck, which made sense given her investigation of the suspicious vehicle. But she'd also run checks on 2 other vehicles that had no apparent connection to the case. One of the additional plate checks was for a white panel van registered to a company called Desert Recovery Services. The other was for a motorcycle registered to someone named David Park. Neither vehicle had been reported stolen, and neither owner had any known connection to Sarah Mitchell, Marcus Kellerman, or the events of that night. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who was leading the investigation into Becca's disappearance, decided to follow up on those additional plate checks. What she found opened up an entirely new line of inquiry that changed everything we thought we knew about what had happened that night. Desert Recovery Services turned out to be a legitimate business that provided towing and recovery services for vehicles that had broken down or been abandoned in remote areas. The company had contracts with several law enforcement agencies, including the Nevada Highway Patrol, to remove abandoned vehicles from state highways. But when Detective Rodriguez contacted the company owner, James Wright, she learned something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Wright said that his white panel van had been stolen from his business lot 2 days before Officer Chen's disappearance, but he hadn't reported the theft because he'd been out of town and hadn't realized the van was missing until after he returned. I just figured one of my employees had taken it for a job and forgotten to tell me, Wright explained. It wasn't until Detective Rodriguez called that I realized the van had actually been stolen. The motorcycle registered to David Park presented an even more disturbing connection. David Park was a former Nevada Highway Patrol officer who'd been terminated 18 months earlier following an internal investigation into allegations of excessive force and corruption. Park had been suspected of stealing drugs and money from traffic stops, but the evidence hadn't been sufficient for criminal charges. After his termination, Park had become increasingly bitter and resentful toward his former colleagues. He'd made threatening statements about getting even with the officers who testified against him during the internal investigation, and he'd been the subject of several restraining orders filed by former co-workers who felt threatened by his behavior. Officer Rebecca Chen had been one of the officers who'd provided testimony during Park's internal investigation. Detective Rodriguez immediately issued a BOLO for David Park and the stolen panel van, and began investigating whether Park's disappearance might be connected to Officer Chen's vanishing. What she found was a pattern of behavior that suggested Park had been planning some kind of revenge against his former colleagues for months. Park's landlord reported that he'd been receiving packages and deliveries for Park that contained what appeared to be surveillance equipment: cameras, listening devices, GPS trackers, and other electronic gear. Neighbors said Park had been keeping irregular hours and had been seen loading and unloading equipment from his motorcycle at all hours of the night. Most disturbing, when Rodriguez obtained a warrant to search Park's apartment, they found detailed surveillance notes on several Nevada Highway Patrol officers, including Rebecca Chen. The notes included information about patrol schedules, usual routes, radio frequencies, and personal information that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance. Park's notes on Officer Chen were particularly detailed and recent. He documented her patrol patterns on Highway 95, identified the remote areas where she was most likely to be alone, and even noted the times when radio communication was most difficult due to terrain features. The final entry in Park's surveillance log was dated the day before Chen's disappearance. RC working midnight shift tomorrow, H95 Sector 87-134. Best Opportunity Canyon Area, MM120, Radio Dead Zone. Perfect. The evidence suggested that David Park had been planning to ambush Officer Chen in the remote canyon where her patrol car was eventually found. But the plan had apparently been complicated by the presence of Marcus Kellerman and Sarah Mitchell in the same area at the same time. Investigators theorized that Park had been lying in wait for Officer Chen when she'd responded to investigate Sarah's abandoned car. Instead of encountering Chen alone as he'd planned, Park had found himself dealing with a more complex situation involving multiple people and vehicles, but the trail went cold there. Despite extensive searches and investigations, David Park was never found. His motorcycle was eventually discovered at the bottom of a deep mine shaft about 50 miles from where Chen's patrol car had been located, but there was no sign of Park himself or any indication of what had happened to him. Marcus Kellerman was also never found. Despite the intensive manhunt that followed Sarah Mitchell's rescue, he seemed to have vanished completely into the Nevada desert. Some investigators believed he died of exposure while fleeing on foot from his abandoned truck, but his body was never recovered. And Officer Rebecca Chen remained missing. Despite years of continued investigation and periodic searches, no trace of her was ever found. She was declared legally dead 5 years after her disappearance, but the case remains officially open and active. The official theory, supported by the evidence recovered during the investigation, is that David Park ambushed Officer Chen in the remote canyon, possibly killed her, and disposed of her body in one of the many abandoned mine shafts that dot the Nevada desert. Park then fled the scene, but died himself while trying to escape through the harsh desert terrain. But there are aspects of the case that don't fit neatly with that theory. If Park had killed Chen and disposed of her body, why abandon her patrol car in a location where it would eventually be found? Why run additional license plate checks on vehicles that had no connection to his revenge plot? And how had he managed to overpower an experienced officer who was armed and alert to potential danger? Some investigators have proposed alternative theories. Maybe Chen discovered Park's surveillance operation and confronted him, leading to a struggle that ended with both of them falling into a mine shaft or hidden cave. Maybe Park succeeded in kidnapping Chen and took her to a remote location where both of them later died of exposure or other causes. The most disturbing theory, though one that lacks supporting evidence, is that Park didn't act alone. If he'd had accomplices helping with his revenge plot, they might have been able to overpower Chen and dispose of both her and Park when the operation went wrong. That would explain why both Chen and Park vanished without a trace, and why the evidence trail ended so abruptly. The impact of Rebecca Chen's disappearance on the Nevada Highway Patrol was profound and lasting. Officer safety protocols were completely revised, with new requirements for regular check-ins, GPS tracking of patrol vehicles, and backup procedures for officers working remote areas alone. The department also implemented new screening procedures for terminated employees, including monitoring of their activities and communications to identify potential threats to current officers. The surveillance equipment found in David Park's apartment led to policy changes regarding how the department tracks and secures information about officer schedules and patrol routes. But beyond the procedural changes, Chen's disappearance affected the morale and psychology of every officer in the department. The knowledge that one of their colleagues had simply vanished while doing her job, with no clear explanation of what had happened to her, created a level of anxiety and caution that influenced how everyone approached their work. For me, personally, as the shift supervisor who'd sent Becca out on patrol that night, her disappearance was a reminder of the responsibility that comes with leading officers who work in dangerous and isolated conditions. I've replayed that night thousands of times in my mind, wondering if there were warning signs I missed or decisions I could have made differently. The memorial service for Officer Chen, held on the 5th anniversary of her disappearance, was attended by hundreds of law enforcement officers from across the country. Her name was added to the Nevada Law Enforcement Memorial, and a stretch of Highway 95 near where she disappeared was renamed in her honor. Sarah Mitchell, who survived her ordeal and testified extensively during the investigation, became an advocate for stalking victims and helped pass legislation that improved legal protections for people being harassed by former partners. She credited Officer Chen with saving her life, saying that Chen's investigation of her abandoned car had led to the search operation that ultimately found her before she died of exposure. Officer Chen put herself in danger to help a stranger, Sarah said during the memorial service. Even though we never met, she was trying to protect me when she disappeared. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor her sacrifice by helping other people who are in the same situation I was. The case remains active in the files of the Nevada Highway Patrol's Criminal Investigation Division. Every few years, new technologies or investigative techniques lead to renewed searches or analysis of the evidence. But so far, nothing has provided definitive answers about what happened to Rebecca Chen. I retired from the Nevada Highway Patrol 3 years ago, but I still think about Becca's case regularly. I still drive Highway 95 sometimes when I'm traveling between Las Vegas and Reno, and I always slow down when I pass mile marker 120, where her last radio transmission originated. The desert keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets involve people who dedicated their lives to protecting others. Officer Rebecca Chen answered a call to investigate a suspicious vehicle, and in doing so she walked into a situation that cost her life but may have saved the life of a stranger. That's the reality of law enforcement work that civilians don't always understand. Every call has the potential to be dangerous. Every traffic stop could be your last, and every decision you make might be the difference between going home to your family or becoming a name on a memorial wall. Rebecca Chen knew those risks when she put on her uniform and drove out onto Highway 95 that night. She chose to serve anyway, because she understood that someone had to be willing to stand between the darkness and the people who couldn't protect themselves. Her last radio call was about investigating something that didn't make sense, something that was out of place in her familiar patrol sector. In following up on that observation, she disappeared into the Nevada desert, leaving behind only questions and the memory of an officer who cared enough about a stranger's abandoned car to put herself in harm's way. Sometimes the night shift takes officers into situations they can't control, where courage and training aren't enough to guarantee survival. But the fact that officers like Rebecca Chen are willing to face those dangers anyway is what makes it possible for the rest of us to travel safely through the darkness, knowing that someone is watching over us, even in the most remote and isolated places. The radio still crackles with routine traffic stops and abandoned vehicle calls. But now, every officer who works Highway 95 knows that sometimes those routine calls lead to situations that are anything but routine, and that the price of protecting others can be higher than anyone wants to pay. Officer Rebecca Chen paid that price on a cold March night in the Nevada desert, and her sacrifice continues to protect and inspire the officers who patrol that same stretch of highway today. Her last radio call was about investigating the unknown, and in honoring her memory, we continue that investigation, hoping that someday the desert will give up its secrets and provide the answers that have eluded us for so long. The psychological profile that the FBI developed on David Park painted a picture of a man who'd been consumed by rage and the need for revenge after his termination from the highway patrol. Park had grown up in foster care, had no close family relationships, and had struggled with authority figures throughout his life. His military service record showed multiple disciplinary actions, and his employment history before joining law enforcement was spotty at best. According to the profile, Park's identity had been completely wrapped up in being a police officer. When that identity was stripped away during his termination, he'd experienced what psychologists call a narcissistic collapse, a complete breakdown of his sense of self-worth that manifested as paranoid thinking and homicidal rage toward those he blamed for his downfall. Park saw his former colleagues not just as enemies, but as people who had destroyed his entire reason for existing, explained Dr. Sarah Holbrook, the FBI behavioral analyst who worked on the case. In his mind, they had taken away everything that defined him as a person. That kind of psychological injury often leads to elaborate revenge fantasies that can take months or years to develop into actual violence. The surveillance equipment found in Park's apartment suggested that his revenge planning had been extensive and methodical. He'd purchased cameras capable of night vision recording, GPS tracking devices that could be attached to vehicles, and radio scanners that would allow him to monitor highway patrol communications. The level of sophistication indicated that Park had been planning his revenge operation for many months. But perhaps most disturbing was a journal that investigators found hidden in Park's apartment during a more thorough search conducted weeks after the initial discovery. The journal detailed Park's growing obsession with Rebecca Chen specifically, and revealed the depths of his psychological deterioration in the months leading up to her disappearance. The early entries in the journal focused on Park's general anger toward the highway patrol and his plans for revenge against multiple officers. But as the months progressed, his attention became increasingly focused on Chen, whom he blamed more than anyone else for his termination. "RC thinks she's so perfect," read one entry from 2 months before Chen's disappearance. "Military hero, model officer, everyone's favorite. She was the one who really buried me with her testimony. She made it sound like I was some kind of monster, when all I was doing was the job the way it needed to be done. She's going to learn what a real monster looks like." Later, entries became increasingly detailed about Chen's patrol patterns, and increasingly violent in their descriptions of what Park planned to do to her. The final entries, written in the days immediately before Chen's disappearance, described specific plans for abducting her in the remote canyon where her patrol car was eventually found. "Tomorrow night is perfect," read the final entry. "RC will be alone on Highway 95, working the midnight shift. I've watched her enough to know exactly where she'll be and when. The canyon area near mile marker 120 is completely isolated. No radio coverage, no backup within 30 minutes. I'll have plenty of time to make her understand what she did to me before I finish this." The journal entries provided crucial evidence about Park's state of mind and his specific plans for targeting Chen. But they also raised new questions about what had actually happened that night. If Park had been planning to abduct and torture Chen in the remote canyon, why had her patrol car been found there apparently undamaged? And why was there no physical evidence of a struggle or violent confrontation? One theory that emerged from the psychological analysis was that Park's plan had been disrupted by the presence of Marcus Kellerman and Sarah Mitchell in the same area. Park had been expecting to find Chen alone, but instead had encountered a complex situation involving multiple people and vehicles. The unexpected complications might have caused him to panic and abandon his carefully planned operation. But that theory didn't explain what had happened to Chen herself. If Park had abducted her as planned, where was her body? If he'd killed her in the canyon, why was there no physical evidence of violence? And if he'd abandoned his plan and fled, what had caused Chen to disappear without a trace? The investigation took another significant turn when, 6 months after Chen's disappearance, a hiker found human remains in a remote mine shaft about 30 miles from where her patrol car had been discovered. The remains were badly decomposed and partially scattered by wildlife, but dental records confirmed that they belonged to David Park. The condition of Park's remains suggested that he'd been dead for approximately the same length of time that he'd been missing, which meant he'd died around the time of Chen's disappearance. But the location where his body was found raised new questions about the sequence of events that night. The mine shaft where Park's remains were discovered was extremely remote and difficult to access, requiring several hours of hiking through rough desert terrain to reach. It wasn't the kind of location someone would stumble into by accident, which suggested that Park had either been very familiar with the area or had been taken there by someone else. Forensic examination of Park's remains revealed that he'd died from a gunshot wound to the head. The bullet recovered from his skull was consistent with ammunition used in law enforcement service weapons, specifically the type of rounds issued to Nevada Highway Patrol officers. That discovery led investigators to consider a new possibility. Perhaps Rebecca Chen had survived Park's initial attack and had managed to turn the tables on her would-be killer. Maybe she'd shot Park in self-defense but had then been injured herself or become lost in the desert while trying to find her way back to safety. The theory gained support when investigators found Park's motorcycle at the bottom of the same mine shaft where his body had been discovered. The motorcycle showed signs of having been deliberately pushed or thrown into the shaft, rather than accidentally falling in. Someone had taken considerable effort to dispose of both Park and his vehicle in a location where they were unlikely to be found. But if Chen had killed Park in self-defense and then disposed of his body and motorcycle, where was she? And why hadn't she contacted law enforcement or tried to return to her patrol car? The timeline didn't make sense, and there was still no physical evidence to support any specific theory about what had happened. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery of additional evidence in the mine shaft. Along with Park's remains and motorcycle, investigators found several items that had belonged to Chen: her service weapon, her radio, and her badge. The items appeared to have been placed in the shaft deliberately, rather than falling in accidentally. Most puzzling was the condition of Chen's radio. When investigators examined it, they found that it had been deliberately damaged, with the antenna broken off and the internal circuitry destroyed. Someone had taken considerable effort to ensure that the radio could never be used to transmit or receive communications again. "It's like someone was trying to send a message," observed Detective Rodriguez. "They didn't just kill Park and dump his body. They took the time to collect Chen's equipment and dispose of it in the same location. That suggests a level of planning and deliberation that doesn't fit with a spontaneous act of self-defense." The FBI expanded their investigation to consider whether Chen's disappearance might have been the result of a larger conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators. If Park had been working with accomplices, they might have been able to overpower Chen even after she'd managed to kill Park. The accomplices could then have disposed of both bodies and planted evidence to confuse the investigation. But despite extensive investigation into Park's associates and known contacts, no evidence of accomplices was ever found. Park appeared to have been a loner who'd planned and executed his revenge operation entirely on his own. The sophisticated surveillance equipment found in his apartment showed no signs of having been shared or coordinated with other people. As the investigation continued without producing definitive answers, various theories emerged within law enforcement about what might have actually happened that night. Some investigators believed that Chen had killed Park in self-defense, but had then died herself from injuries sustained during the struggle. Others theorized that both Chen and Park had been killed by a third party who had stumbled onto their confrontation. The most exotic theory, promoted by some UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists, was that Chen's disappearance was connected to classified military activities in the Nevada desert. The area around Highway 95 is relatively close to several military installations, including the Nevada Test Site and Nellis Air Force Base, and some people believed that Chen had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. But law enforcement investigators found no credible evidence to support any involvement by military or government agencies. The physical evidence consistently pointed to David Park as the primary suspect in Chen's disappearance, even though the exact circumstances of what had happened remained unclear. The case took on a life of its own in the media and popular culture. True crime podcasts dissected every piece of evidence. Amateur investigators proposed elaborate theories about what had happened, and Chen's disappearance became the subject of several books and documentaries. The attention kept the case in the public eye, but also generated numerous false leads and conspiracy theories that complicated the ongoing investigation. One of the most persistent alternative theories was that Chen had survived her encounter with Park and had chosen to disappear deliberately. Proponents of this theory pointed to Chen's military background and survival training, arguing that she would have been capable of living off the grid in the Nevada desert if she'd chosen to do so. Rebecca Chen was Special Forces, argued one online forum dedicated to the case. She had advanced survival training and knew how to operate in hostile environments. Maybe she killed Park in self-defense and then realized that there might be more people coming after her. Maybe she decided that the only way to stay safe was to disappear completely. But investigators found no evidence to support the voluntary disappearance theory. Chen's bank accounts had never been accessed after her disappearance, her credit cards had never been used, and she'd never contacted any family members or friends. Her complete absence from any kind of electronic or financial trail suggested that if she was alive, she was living in a way that would be extremely difficult to maintain long-term. The impact of Chen's disappearance extended far beyond the Nevada Highway Patrol. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their procedures for protecting officers from threats by former colleagues and implementing new protocols for monitoring terminated employees who might pose risks to current officers. The case also led to improvements in officer safety technology. GPS tracking systems became standard equipment in patrol vehicles, allowing dispatchers to monitor officer locations in real time. Emergency beacons were developed that officers could activate if they were in distress, and communication systems were upgraded to provide better coverage in remote areas. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the culture and psychology of law enforcement itself. Chen's disappearance forced officers to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest threats they faced came not from criminals or dangerous situations, but from their own former colleagues who had been consumed by anger and resentment. "Every officer knows that the job is dangerous," explained Chief Patricia Williams, who had taken over leadership of the Nevada Highway Patrol after the previous chief retired in the wake of Chen's disappearance. "We're trained to deal with armed criminals, high-speed chases, domestic violence situations, and all kinds of external threats. But Rebecca's case taught us that we also have to be alert to threats from within our own ranks." The department implemented new psychological screening procedures for all officers, with regular evaluations designed to identify signs of stress, anger, or mental health issues that might lead to dangerous behavior. Officers who were terminated or who resigned under pressure were subject to ongoing monitoring to assess whether they posed threats to their former colleagues. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize warning signs of potentially violent behavior in their colleagues and to provide resources for getting help before problems escalated to the level of violence. The programs emphasized that seeking help for mental health issues was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that the department was committed to supporting officers who were struggling with personal or professional problems. The Rebecca Chen Memorial Foundation was established by her family and former colleagues to provide scholarships for the children of law enforcement officers and to fund research into officer safety and mental health. The foundation also supported training programs designed to help officers deal with the psychological stresses of law enforcement work. Chen's partner, Officer Maria Santos, became a national advocate for officer safety and mental health awareness. Santos had worked closely with Chen for 3 years and had been devastated by her disappearance. She channeled her grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies from occurring to other officers. "Rebecca was the best partner I ever had," Santos said during a speech at a national law enforcement conference. "She was smart, brave, and completely dedicated to protecting people. The fact that she was killed by someone who was supposed to be on the same side as us is something that every officer needs to think about. We have to take care of each other, and that means recognizing when someone in our ranks is struggling and getting them help before they become dangerous." The annual memorial service for Rebecca Chen became a major event in the law enforcement community, drawing hundreds of officers from across the country. The service served both to honor Chen's memory and to remind officers of the importance of supporting their colleagues and maintaining the integrity of their profession. But despite all the procedural changes, training programs, and memorials, the central mystery of what happened to Rebecca Chen remained unsolved. The physical evidence provided clues, but no definitive answers, and the various theories about her disappearance remained just that. Theories unsupported by conclusive proof. Detective Rodriguez, who had led the investigation for its first 3 years, retired from law enforcement partly because of her frustration with the case. "I've worked hundreds of cases over my career, and I've always been able to find answers eventually," she said during her retirement interview. But Rebecca's case is different. Every piece of evidence we found seemed to point in a different direction, and no matter how hard we worked, we never got to the truth. Rodriguez's replacement, Detective Mark Thompson, brought fresh eyes to the case but reached similar conclusions. The evidence tells us that David Park was planning to harm Officer Chen and that both of them disappeared on the same night, Thompson explained. But the exact sequence of events that led to their disappearances may never be known. Sometimes the desert keeps its secrets, no matter how hard we try to uncover them. The case remained active in the department's files, with periodic reviews of the evidence, and occasional new searches when tips or leads warranted investigation. But as the years passed, the likelihood of finding definitive answers decreased, and the case gradually moved from active investigation to cold case status. The stretch of Highway 95 where Chen disappeared was renamed the Officer Rebecca Chen Memorial Highway, with markers placed at regular intervals to honor her memory and remind travelers of her sacrifice. The remote canyon where her patrol car was found became an unofficial pilgrimage site for law enforcement officers, who would sometimes stop there during their patrols to pay their respects. Chen's family never gave up hope that someday they would learn what had happened to her. Her parents established a reward fund for information leading to the discovery of her remains, and they regularly traveled to Nevada to meet with investigators and participate in searches. Her younger brother joined the military and then law enforcement, saying that he wanted to carry on Rebecca's mission of protecting people. Rebecca always said that being a police officer wasn't just a job, it was a calling. her brother David explained during a television interview on the 5th anniversary of her disappearance. She felt responsible for keeping people safe, even when it meant putting herself in danger. I know that whatever happened to her that night, she was trying to help someone. That's who she was. The mystery of Rebecca Chen's disappearance became part of the folklore of the Nevada Highway Patrol, passed down from veteran officers to rookies as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. New officers learned about the importance of radio protocols, backup procedures, and officer safety, partly through the story of what had happened to Chen when she'd encountered a situation that was more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. But they also learned about courage, dedication, and the willingness to put the safety of others above your own safety. Chen's last radio transmission had been about investigating something that didn't make sense, something that was out of place on her familiar patrol route. In choosing to investigate that anomaly, she demonstrated the curiosity and concern for public safety that defined the best law enforcement officers. The radio equipment in highway patrol vehicles was upgraded with Chen's case in mind, providing better coverage in remote areas and more reliable communication with dispatch. Officers were trained to provide more detailed location information during their transmissions, and new protocols required check-ins at shorter intervals when officers were working alone in isolated areas. GPS tracking systems allowed dispatchers to monitor officer locations continuously, but they also served as a reminder of Chen's disappearance. Every time an officer's GPS signal was lost or communications were interrupted, dispatchers were trained to respond quickly and aggressively, with the knowledge that temporary communication problems could sometimes indicate serious emergencies. The psychological impact of Chen's case extended beyond law enforcement to the families and communities that officers served. The knowledge that a dedicated officer could simply vanish while doing her job created anxiety and concern among police families, who already understood the dangers inherent in law enforcement work. Support groups were established for the spouses and families of law enforcement officers, providing resources for dealing with the stress and uncertainty that came with having a loved one work in a dangerous profession. The groups often referenced Chen's case as an example of why it was important to cherish every moment with their officer family members and to never take their safe return home for granted. The media attention surrounding Chen's disappearance also led to increased public awareness of the challenges and dangers faced by law enforcement officers, particularly those working alone in remote areas. Documentary filmmakers and journalists who covered the case often emphasized the isolation and vulnerability of officers patrolling hundreds of miles of empty highway with backup that might be hours away. But the coverage also highlighted the dedication and professionalism of officers like Chen, who chose to work those dangerous assignments because they understood that someone needed to be there to help travelers who found themselves in trouble far from populated areas. The stories of successful rescues and crime prevention that emerged from highway patrol operations helped balance the tragic narrative of Chen's disappearance. The technological advances that resulted from Chen's case, improved communications, GPS tracking, emergency beacons, and other safety equipment, were eventually adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country. While the immediate goal was to prevent similar disappearances from occurring, the broader impact was to make police work safer and more effective in all kinds of situations. Research into officer safety and mental health that was funded by the Rebecca Chen Memorial Foundation led to new understanding of the psychological stresses faced by law enforcement officers and better methods for identifying and treating mental health issues before they led to dangerous behavior. The research was particularly focused on understanding how job-related stress, workplace conflicts, and personal problems could combine to create risks for both officers and the public they served. The foundation also funded research into missing person investigations and search and rescue techniques, with the goal of improving law enforcement's ability to find officers who disappeared or were injured while on duty. Some of the techniques developed through this research were later used in other cases involving missing officers, leading to successful rescues that might not have been possible otherwise. But perhaps the most important legacy of Rebecca Chen's case was the reminder it provided about the human cost of law enforcement work. Behind every badge was a person with family, friends, hopes, and dreams who had chosen to dedicate their life to protecting others. When officers like Chen disappeared or were killed in the line of duty, the loss extended far beyond their immediate families to include their professional families and the communities they had served. The annual reading of Chen's name at law enforcement memorial services across the country served as a reminder that the dangers of police work weren't always obvious or predictable. Sometimes officers were killed in dramatic shootouts or high-speed chases that made national news. But sometimes they simply vanished while investigating a routine call, leaving behind only questions and the memory of someone who had cared enough about public safety to put themselves in harm's way. The mystery of what happened to Officer Rebecca Chen on that March night in the Nevada desert may never be solved. The desert has kept its secrets for 5 years now, and each passing year makes it less likely that definitive answers will ever emerge. But the impact of her disappearance continues to ripple through law enforcement and the communities that officers serve, making the profession safer and reminding everyone of the sacrifices that are made every day to keep the public safe. Her last radio call was about investigating the unknown, and in the end, she became part of that unknown herself. But her legacy lives on in the improved safety procedures, enhanced training programs, and increased awareness that resulted from the investigation into her disappearance. Every officer who comes home safely because of better communication equipment or improved backup procedures is a testament to the meaning that can be found even in the most tragic and mysterious circumstances. The night shift on Highway 95 continues, with new officers taking up the responsibility that Rebecca Chen carried until her final transmission. They patrol the same remote stretches of desert, respond to the same types of calls, and face the same risks that she faced. But they do so with better equipment, improved procedures, and the knowledge that their colleagues and the public understand and appreciate the dangers they face every time they answer a call to investigate something that doesn't quite make sense on a lonely highway in the middle of the night.